He was 32 years old, sitting in a hallway outside a conference room, rehearsing an apology he hadn't been asked to give yet. That's the kind of man Liam Carter was. Not a villain, not a failure, just a man who had spent so many years being the last person anyone expected to matter that he had started believing it himself. What he didn't know, what nobody bothered to tell him, was that the most powerful woman in the building had been watching him for a very long time, and she had already decided he was worth saving. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's get into it. The alarm went off at 6:47, not 6:45, not 7. 6:47, because that was exactly the amount of time Liam Carter needed to get everything done before the world expected him to show up and pretend he had it together. He was already awake when it buzzed, had been lying there for the better part of 20 minutes, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that was shaped, if you tilted your head just right, like the state of Ohio. He'd noticed it 8 months ago when they moved into this apartment. He still hadn't fixed it. There was always something more urgent. He reached over and silenced the alarm before it could wake Sophie. That was the whole game, really. Every morning, keep Sophie asleep for 10 more minutes so she could get the rest a 7-year-old needed, while her father dragged himself into the kitchen and started assembling a life out of whatever was left in the refrigerator. He stood in front of the open fridge in his boxers and a faded Northwestern sweatshirt, the one with the cracked lettering across the chest, the one he'd owned since his sophomore year and kept wearing because throwing it away felt like admitting something, and stared at its contents with the blank expression of a man who had already made too many decisions before the sun came up. 2 eggs, half a block of cheddar that was starting to go a little suspicious on one corner, leftover pasta from Tuesday, orange juice, almost empty, a single strawberry yogurt with a cartoon bear on the lid, which belonged to Sophie and was therefore untouchable. He made the eggs. He stood at the stove and scrambled them with a fork because he could never find the whisk. And he thought about the pitch deck he'd been reworking until midnight. He thought about the headline that still wasn't landing. He thought about the fact that Marcus from the creative team had gone over his head twice in the last month to present ideas that were originally Liam's, slightly restructured, freshly formatted, delivered with Marcus's particular brand of loud, arm-waving confidence that seemed to convince everyone in the room that genius had just walked in. He thought about how he'd said nothing both times. He thought about that more than he wanted to. Daddy. He turned. Sophie was standing in the kitchen doorway in her purple pajamas with the faded stars on them, one sock on, one sock missing, her hair a spectacular disaster around her face. She was holding Mr. Buttons, the stuffed rabbit with one eye, by the ear, which was the only way she ever carried him. "Hey, Bug," he said. "I told you to sleep a little longer." "I dreamed about the ocean," she announced, walking past him and climbing onto her stool at the kitchen counter with the seriousness of a small person who had important things to communicate. "There were purple fish." "Were there?" "Lots of them, and one of them could talk." "What did it say?" She considered this very carefully. It said, "Good morning," in a fish voice. Liam turned back to the eggs. Sounds like a polite fish. He was very polite, she agreed. Then, with a 7-year-old's complete lack of transition, "Can I have the yogurt?" "That's breakfast." "That's what I said." He looked at her over his shoulder. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes, wide and very dark and completely unbothered by any inconvenience. And he thought, not for the first time, that his daughter was going to be a lawyer someday, or a hostage negotiator, something that required the ability to maintain total composure while dismantling someone else's position. "Fine," he said. "Yogurt and half the eggs." Deal. That was how the morning started. That was how most mornings started. Mkim. By 8:15, Sophie was at school, Liam was on the L train heading toward the Loop, and the city was doing what Chicago did in early October, which was to say, it was cold enough to remind you it was coming, but not cold enough to be honest about it yet. He stood in the aisle with one hand on the overhead rail, his canvas bag over one shoulder, his laptop inside it, along with a granola bar he'd remembered to grab at the last second. He was running the headline in his head again. Because results don't wait for the perfect moment. No. Too generic. Your audience isn't coming to you. You have to go first. Better, maybe. The brands that win aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that say the right thing to the right person at exactly the right second. He pulled out his phone and typed that into his notes, then stared at it, then deleted exactly and moved on. The train rocked. Someone nearby was eating a breakfast sandwich that smelled aggressively of egg and processed meat. A teenager with enormous headphones stood pressed against the door, head nodding to something Liam couldn't hear. He had been a copywriter at Kensington Creative for 4 years. Before that, 2 years at a smaller boutique agency downtown that had dissolved quietly when its founders decided they hated each other. Before that, a year of freelancing from his kitchen table while Sophie was an infant, and the world was very loud and the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning felt like a different planet. He was good at his job. He knew he was good at his job the way a person knows a thing they've never quite been able to say out loud without it sounding like a boast. He could feel when a line of copy landed. He could feel when it was wrong. He had instincts that were sometimes, in the privacy of his own mind, quite good. The problem was that the privacy of his own mind wasn't where the copy needed to land. It needed to land in conference rooms full of people who talked faster and louder and with far more visible certainty than he ever seemed to manage. He'd always been better on paper than in person. His boss before Ava Kensington had told him once, not unkindly, that he needed to own his voice. He'd nodded and said he'd work on that, and then spent the next 6 months wondering what exactly that meant, because as far as he could tell, he owned his voice just fine. He just didn't always think it deserved an audience. The train pulled into Washington Station. Liam got off, walked 2 blocks in the wind, and pushed through the glass doors of the building that housed Kensington Creative's offices on the 14th and 15th floors. Nobody talked about Ava Kensington the way they'd talk about a normal boss. They talked about her the way people talk about weather systems. She was a force of nature that arrived, assessed the situation, and rearranged it. You prepared for her. You adjusted your plans around her. You didn't take her personally because she wasn't personal. She was the atmosphere. That was the office mythology anyway. The reality, as Liam had understood it across 4 years of careful observation from a respectful distance, was both simpler and stranger than the mythology suggested. Ava Kensington was 30 years old, 2 years younger than him, something that occasionally struck him as slightly absurd, and she had taken over as CEO of her family's agency 18 months ago when her father's health had forced him to step back. She hadn't inherited a comfortable position. She'd inherited a company that was losing 2 mid-sized accounts a quarter to younger, flashier competitors, and she'd spent the first 6 months making cuts and changes that generated enough hallway whispers to fill a small newspaper. She was not warm. She was not chatty. She did not come to the company holiday party and stand by the cheese table making small talk. She was, however, unfailingly precise. She knew every account. She remembered details from presentations that had happened a year prior. She gave feedback that was never vague. It was always surgical, occasionally uncomfortable, and almost always correct. She doesn't smile enough, Rachel from accounts had said once, in the way people say something they think is a complaint, but is actually a compliment they resent giving. She smiled at Daniels when he landed the Phelan account, someone else had replied. That's not a smile. That's an acknowledgement. This was the thing about Ava. She ran so hot in terms of intelligence and expectation that the smallest moments of warmth from her, a nod in a meeting, a quiet, good work on a revised document, registered like events. People noted them. People remembered them. Liam had received exactly 3 such moments in 4 years. The first was in his 2nd month, when she'd stopped briefly at his desk after reviewing a piece of web copy he'd written for a mid-market retail client and said, "The last 3 lines. Don't change them." He hadn't known how to respond. She'd already walked away. The second was a year later when he'd stayed until 9:30 on a Friday to finish a rebrand brief, and she'd found him still at his desk on her way out and said, "You don't have to stay this late." "I know," he'd said. She'd looked at him a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Right," she'd said, and left. The third was 6 weeks ago, when she'd passed him in the hall and glanced at the pages he was carrying and said, without breaking stride, "The Larson campaign is stronger than you think it is." He still wasn't sure how she'd known it was the Larson campaign from 6 feet away. These 3 moments existed in some separate category in Liam's mind, not because he had any particular illusions about them, but because they were data. They were evidence that somewhere in the machinery of Ava Kensington's relentlessly forward-moving attention, Liam Carter existed as a specific person rather than a general employee. What he did with that information was nothing, because there was nothing reasonable to do with it. He went to his desk. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the pitch deck. The office filled around him the way it always did, gradually, loudly, with the particular energy of a creative agency that prided itself on being a little chaotic, while also, paradoxically, caring enormously about results. People brought coffee. Someone played music from a small Bluetooth speaker at a volume that was technically acceptable but spiritually aggressive. Marcus from Creative walked past Liam's desk without looking at him, which was Marcus's default setting. At 9:15, Liam's email pinged. He almost didn't look at it immediately because he was in the middle of a sentence, and he was one of those people who couldn't stop mid-sentence without losing the whole thread. He finished the sentence, made a note in the margin, and then opened the email. It was from Ava Kensington's assistant, a woman named Dana, who communicated with the efficiency of someone for whom time was a physical resource being metered out in very small quantities. Mr. Carter, Miss Kensington would like you to join her at 9:45 in conference room B for a brief meeting regarding the Meridian pitch. Please confirm. He read it 3 times. Then he looked up at the office around him as if someone might have sent it to the wrong person and the right person might be nearby, looking confused. No one was looking confused. He typed back, confirmed. I'll be there. Then spent about 45 seconds wondering if that sounded too casual, then decided it was fine and sent it and went back to his pitch deck, where he couldn't think about anything else. The Meridian pitch was not his account. The Meridian pitch belonged to a team of 5 people, headed by a senior account director named Patrick Healy, who had been at the firm for 9 years and had the kind of institutional comfort that comes from having survived multiple leadership transitions. Liam had done some secondary copy work for the supporting materials, a tagline, a brand voice document, but he was functionally peripheral to the whole thing. Why Ava Kensington wanted to discuss the Meridian pitch with him in conference room B without Patrick Healy at 9:45 on a Tuesday morning was not something Liam could construct a reasonable explanation for. By 9:40, he had convinced himself it was a mistake. She'd meant to email someone else. There was another Carter in the company. Was there? He checked the staff directory. There was not. He picked up his notebook and pen, mostly because showing up to a meeting with Ava Kensington without something to write with felt like arriving at a dinner party in pajamas, and walked to conference room B. She was already there when he arrived. She was standing at the window with a tablet in her hand, scrolling with one thumb. And she didn't look up immediately when he walked in. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back, and she had the posture of a person who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Close the door," she said. He closed the door. She looked up then and gestured at the chair across from where she was standing. He sat. She didn't sit. She set the tablet down on the conference table and looked at him the way she seemed to look at most things, directly, without decorative preface. "The Meridian presentation is in 4 days," she said, "in Milwaukee. I'm taking a small team. You're on it." The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long. To Liam, it felt like a significant portion of his adult life. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want to make sure I understand. You're on the team for the Milwaukee trip, Thursday morning. You'll prepare your section of the pitch and be ready to present it Friday." "My section. Brand voice and consumer messaging. The work you did for the supporting materials was the strongest part of the whole package." She said this without any particular emphasis, as if it were simply information she was conveying rather than a compliment. "Patrick Healy will lead the overall presentation. You'll take the consumer messaging segment." Liam opened his notebook and then didn't write anything because he didn't know what to write. His pen hovered. "Miss Kensington," he said, and then stopped. She waited. She was, he noticed, very good at waiting. Most people, when they expected someone to keep talking, would give some social cue, a small nod, an encouraging shift of the body. She gave nothing. She simply waited, and the absence of those cues made the silence feel even more present. "I just want to be sure this is the right call," he said. "Patrick has more experience with this kind of client. Patrick's section is the financial framework and the campaign architecture. That's where his experience is useful." She picked up her tablet again, which had the subtle effect of suggesting the meeting was moving forward whether Liam was ready or not. "Your section is about what the customer feels when they see the brand. That's not Patrick's strongest ground." "But there are other writers on the team." "There are." She looked up at him again. "I chose you." Those 3 words sat in the room like something solid. He looked down at his notebook. There was nothing written on the page. He'd been gripping the pen hard enough that his fingers had left slight indentations in the cardboard edge of the cover. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She nodded once, the way someone does when a piece of machinery has finally cooperated. "Dana will send you the travel details. Bring the brand voice document and be prepared to expand it into a full narrative section. 10 minutes minimum." "Understood." She was already turning back to her tablet. The meeting was over. He stood, tucked his notebook under his arm, and moved toward the door. "Carter." He turned. She was still looking at her tablet. "The Larson tagline you developed, the final one, did you fight for it or did you let it get changed?" It was such an unexpected question that he answered honestly before he had time to manage it. "They changed the second half. I didn't push back." She looked up. "Why not?" "I wasn't sure it was worth the argument." She held his gaze for a moment. "Not long, but long enough." "It was worth the argument," she said. Then she looked back at her tablet, and he walked out into the hallway and stood there for a minute, breathing the open office air and trying to organize what had just happened into some kind of shape he could understand. He couldn't quite manage it. He went back to his desk and started preparing for Milwaukee. He didn't tell many people he was going on the trip. He told Rachel because Rachel's desk was adjacent to his, and she would have noticed the absence and asked. And Liam had never been good at deflecting Rachel's questions. He told her on Wednesday afternoon while she was eating a bowl of soup at her desk and barely looking up. "Milwaukee," she said. "Yeah." "With Kensington?" "And Patrick and 2 others from the team." Rachel looked up from her soup. She had a particular expression she deployed when she suspected something interesting was happening. Eyebrows slightly raised, spoon paused, mid-journey. "Kensington personally asked you?" "Dana sent the email, but yeah." "What does mean?" "It means She went back to her soup. "Don't screw it up." "Thank you, Rachel. Very supportive." "I'm always supportive. I'm also honest. Those 2 things can coexist." He went home that night and made Sophie macaroni and cheese, the real kind, from the box with the orange powder, because Wednesday was her pick. And she'd been making the same choice since she was 4. And while she talked about her day at school, about a boy named Theo who had brought a gecko to class in his backpack, and the entire afternoon had been disrupted, Liam sat across from her and thought about Milwaukee. "Daddy," Sophie said. "Yeah, Bug. You're not listening." "I am," he said. "The gecko. Theo." "You're listening to words but not to the story." He put his fork down. "Tell me again. From the beginning." She sighed with the enormous patience of someone who had resigned herself to her father's limitations. "So Theo has this gecko named Pepperoni." "The gecko's name is Pepperoni?" "That's what I said." She gave him a look. "Are you going to let me tell the story?" "Yes. Sorry. Pepperoni." "So Pepperoni is in Theo's backpack, right? And nobody knows. And then in the middle of Mrs. Alvarez's lesson about fractions, this scratching sound starts happening." She told him the whole story with the kind of detailed narrative commitment that made Liam think, not for the first time, that whatever she ended up doing in life, she was going to be good at it. She had her mother's storytelling instinct, that pull forward, that sense that the next sentence mattered. He smiled through the whole thing and laughed at the right parts and asked the right follow-up questions. And when she was done and had gone to brush her teeth, he sat alone at the kitchen table and felt the space of the apartment around him, with that particular weight he'd become so familiar with over the years. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. He'd stopped calling it that because loneliness implied a wish that things were otherwise, and the truth was more complicated. Sophie was the organizing fact of his life. She was the thing that made every other thing make sense, even on the days when everything felt impossibly heavy. He didn't wish she wasn't there. He just sometimes wished, quietly and without expecting anything from the wish, that there was someone else to sit at the kitchen table with after she went to bed. He got his laptop and worked on the Milwaukee presentation until 11:30. The headline gave him trouble. He wrote 7 versions. Meridian isn't just a product. It's a permission slip. That one was too cute. The customer you want isn't waiting for an invitation. They're waiting for proof. Better. Sharper. He kept going. Thursday morning, he dropped Sophie at his neighbor, Mrs. Baxter's apartment. Mrs. Baxter was 68, recently retired from a career in hospital administration, and had the combination of warmth and organizational capability that made her, in Liam's life, something close to essential. She watched Sophie whenever he had to be somewhere. In exchange, Liam fixed things. He'd replaced her kitchen faucet, repainted her bathroom ceiling, assembled a bookshelf that had arrived in 37 pieces without any notation of which piece connected to which. It was a good arrangement. He was grateful for it every single time. "You're nervous," Mrs. Baxter said, looking at him over Sophie's head as Sophie stood in the doorway between them, already telling Mrs. Baxter about Pepperoni the gecko. "I'm fine," Liam said. "Your jaw is doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where it looks like you're holding a sentence you decided not to say." Sophie looked up at him with great interest, apparently finding this assessment accurate. "I have a big presentation," he said. Mrs. Baxter nodded. "And you're going to do well." "You don't know that. I know you've been rewriting something on your phone for the last 3 days, which means you care, which means you've probably done the work." She raised an eyebrow. "Have you done the work?" "Yes." "Then you're fine. Come on, sweetheart." This last part to Sophie. "Let's get some breakfast." Sophie hugged him around the middle without looking away from Mrs. Baxter, the way she did when she was already half gone into the next thing, and the hug was a reflexive goodbye rather than a considered one. He held her for a second anyway. "I'll be back Saturday morning," he told her. "I know," she said. "Bye, Daddy." He took the L to Union Station and caught the 8:15 Amtrak to Milwaukee. He had assumed the trip would be 4 people, himself, Patrick, and 2 others from the account team. And it was, except that Ava Kensington was also on the train, which he hadn't expected. He saw her before she saw him. She was in business class, 2 cars ahead, already working, a coffee on the seat tray beside her, her laptop open, earbuds in. She was reading something on screen with the focused attention she brought to everything, which gave her a slightly remote quality. Not unfriendly exactly, but operating on a frequency that required deliberate tuning. Patrick Healy appeared at Liam's shoulder with the combination of ease and competitive alertness that Patrick brought to most situations involving professional proximity to Ava Kensington. "Didn't know she was taking this train," Patrick said. "Neither did I." Patrick glanced at him sideways. "You ready for Friday?" "Working on it?" "Consumer messaging section." Patrick said it in a neutral tone, which was nevertheless somehow weighted. "That's usually my territory." "I know," Liam said. They found their seats. Patrick settled in and immediately began making calls with the visible busyness of a man performing competence. Liam put his headphones in and opened his document and spent the 2-hour train ride going over every line. Milwaukee in October had a quality he hadn't expected, cleaner than Chicago, quieter, the lake visible from the cab as they drove to the hotel. The Meridian client had booked rooms at a downtown property that was a little too corporate in the lobby but had good windows and decent Wi-Fi, which was, in Liam's experience, the only hotel metric that actually mattered. The hotel front desk clerk, a young woman in her mid-20s with the professionally pleasant expression of someone processing their 14th check-in of the afternoon, tapped at her keyboard and then paused. Tapped again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm seeing a reservation for your party, but there seems to be a discrepancy in the room allocation." Ava Kensington was standing at the counter next to Liam. Patrick and the 2 account managers had already collected their keys and drifted toward the elevator. "What kind of discrepancy?" Ava asked. We have 3 rooms confirmed, but the 4th reservation, more tapping. A slight furrow appeared between the clerk's eyebrows. Doesn't appear to have processed correctly. We're also fully booked tonight due to a regional conference. Ava looked at her. Fully booked? Yes, ma'am. I'm very sorry. I can put you on our cancellation wait list, and there's a property about 12 minutes away that might have availability. What name is on the 4th reservation? Tapping. Carter. Liam became very still. Ava looked at him. He looked at her. The hotel clerk looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had correctly identified that she was in the middle of something and would prefer to be elsewhere. I'll call the other property, Liam said. It's fine. I can... That's not efficient, Ava said. The word efficient doing a lot of work in that sentence. She looked back at the clerk. What are the available room types? We have 1 remaining room. It's a king suite. A pause. It's a large room. It has a sitting area and a separate workspace. Ava was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, we'll take it. Liam started. We have a presentation tomorrow morning, and we're not spending the evening managing a room search. She picked up the key card the clerk was extending toward her. The suite has a sitting area. It's fine. She walked toward the elevator. Liam stood at the desk for a moment, looking at nobody in particular. Congratulations, the clerk offered. He took his key card and followed. The suite was, in fact, large. A king bed on one side of a partial dividing wall, a sitting area with a couch and a coffee table on the other, a separate desk against the far window with a view of the street and the dark suggestion of the lake beyond it. There was a bathroom and a closet and enough actual floor space that 2 adults could exist in the room without being unreasonably aware of each other's physical presence. Liam set his bag down near the couch and stood looking at it as if it might offer guidance. Ava set her bag down near the desk without ceremony. She unzipped it and began removing things: laptop, charger, a slim folder of documents, with the focused efficiency of someone who had simply redefined the parameters of the situation and was now operating within the new parameters. You can have the bed, she said without looking up. I'll work at the desk most of the night. Most of the night? The presentation needs another pass. The transition between Patrick's section and yours is weak, and it's going to cost us 30 seconds of momentum at exactly the wrong time. Liam considered saying something about how she didn't have to do that, work through the night before a major pitch. He reconsidered it immediately because Ava Kensington had clearly already made this decision and was not soliciting input. I can work on my section some more, he said instead. Sit. She gestured at the chair across from the desk. Let's go through it together. This is how it started. Not with any dramatic announcement, not with any explicit agreement about what kind of night this was going to be. Just sit, let's go through it together, and then they were working. She had the whole deck open on her laptop and pulled a second chair around so they were both looking at the screen. She was close enough that he could smell her perfume, something clean and sharp, not sweet. And he was acutely aware of the strangeness of this arrangement while also, gradually, being overtaken by the work itself. That was the thing about work. It had a way of making everything else recede. She pulled up his section and read it. He watched her read it, which was its own particular kind of tension. She didn't react outwardly when she read. Didn't nod, didn't frown. She read with the focused neutrality of a person reserving judgment until they had all the information. Then she said, "The 3rd paragraph." "I know," he said. "Say that again." "I know it's the weakest part." He reached over and scrolled down. The transition from the brand voice into the consumer behavior data feels forced. I was trying to... Don't explain what you were trying to do. Tell me what you think it should do. He looked at the screen. It should make the data feel like it's confirming something the audience already suspected about their customers. Right now, it's presenting the data like it's news. It shouldn't be news. It should feel like recognition. She was quiet for a moment. "Say that in the room tomorrow," she said. "Say what?" "What you just said. This isn't news, it's recognition. Use those exact words." "I was just explaining the concept." "I know you were. That's why it worked." She leaned back in her chair and looked at him with an expression that was harder to categorize than her usual ones. Not assessment, exactly. Something more like confirmation of something she already knew. "You do this thing," she said, Where your best ideas come out when you're explaining yourself rather than presenting. You need to collapse those two things. He didn't know what to say to that. I'm just better in writing, he said finally. You're not, actually. She said it with complete matter-of-factness, the way she'd say the third paragraph, or the presentation needs a pass. You're more comfortable in writing, that's different. Something about the directness of it, the complete absence of softening or diplomatic cushion, made it land differently than a compliment would have. It felt like information, real, usable information. Let's fix the transition, she said, and turned back to the screen. They worked for 4 hours. In that time, something happened that Liam couldn't have fully articulated if asked to describe it afterward. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one of those scenes where things shift with visible significance and everyone knows the moment matters. It was more like a gradual adjustment, like when your eyes finally calibrate to a room's light level and you stop noticing the dark. He saw her differently by degrees. At around 11:30, she set down her pen and picked up the room service menu because neither of them had eaten since a mediocre Amtrak sandwich and said, "What's your daughter's name?" He looked up. "How do you know I have a daughter?" "HR file," she said simply. "I read files when people are new. I sometimes remember things." She was still looking at the menu. "What's her name?" "Sophie." "How old?" 7. He watched her scan the menu. "How do you know her age from an HR file?" "Emergency contact and dependent paperwork. Sophie Elaine Carter, date of birth listed for insurance purposes." She set the menu down. "Is she with someone tonight?" "My neighbor. She's good. She's—" He hesitated. "She's good." Ava ordered 2 sandwiches and coffee over the phone with the precision of someone who had eaten thousands of room service meals and had no illusions about them. When she hung up, she didn't immediately return to the deck. She looked at the window. "My father used to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Say someone was good twice in a row when asked how they were. It means you believe it, but you're tired." Liam looked at his hands. "It's been a long couple of years." "I know." She said it very quietly. Something about the weight of those 2 words made him look at her directly. She was still looking at the window. "My father," she said, "was running this company fine until he wasn't. The transition wasn't planned. Nothing was where it was supposed to be." She paused. "The first 6 months, I went home every night thinking I was going to do irreparable damage to something he built over 30 years. But you didn't. I made plenty of mistakes." She turned from the window. "I just made them at a speed that didn't allow for dwelling on them." There was something in her face that he hadn't seen before in 4 years of seeing her. Not vulnerability, exactly, or if it was the kind that came from exhaustion rather than openness. The kind that appears not because someone has chosen to show you something, but because they simply no longer have the energy to maintain the display. "The brand voice document you wrote," she said, "the Meridian one. There's a line in the introduction section about how the best brands don't make you feel like a customer. They make you feel like someone who made the right choice." "I remember." "That line is personal to you." He said nothing. "You wrote that because you know what it's like to make decisions from a position where the margin for error feels very small," she said. "Single parent, non-senior role, years where one wrong move feels like it costs something irreplaceable." She picked up her pen again and clicked it twice, a habit he was beginning to recognize. "That's why it's the best line in the document, because it's true, and it costs you something to write it." The room was very quiet. "I didn't think you'd read the introduction section that carefully," he said. "I read everything carefully." She turned back to the laptop. "That's why I'm still standing." The room service arrived. They ate at the desk, both of them working, talking through the deck between bites. By 1 in the morning, they had rebuilt the transition section and restructured the closing, and something about the whole thing, the lateness, the food, the small pool of lamplight they were sitting in, had dismantled whatever professional distance usually governed interactions in this particular direction. Not eliminated, not replaced with something else, just softened to a degree that allowed language to move more freely. "You're going to lead part of the pitch tomorrow," she said at one point, somewhere around midnight, while they were reworking the opening of his section. "I know. You sound like that's bad news." "No, He stopped. I'm just not entirely sure why you picked me for this. She looked at him sideways. I told you, the copy was the strongest part of the package. Marcus has written for larger accounts. Marcus writes copy that sounds like copy, she said, with a flatness that was not unkind but also did not invite debate. Yours sounds like someone trying to communicate something. She turned back to the screen. There's a difference. The Meridian people will feel it. He wrote that down in the margin of his notebook, then felt slightly embarrassed about writing it down, then decided he didn't care. He fell asleep on his couch around 1:30, unexpectedly, not a decision he made but a failure of intention, his eyes simply closing in the middle of rereading a paragraph. He woke at 5:45 to the sound of the shower running, gray-blue light coming through the curtain, the room reorganized while he slept. His shoes had been placed neatly at the end of the couch. The room service tray had been moved to the floor. His notebook had a post-it on it that read, in Ava's clean, angular handwriting, "The closing is better. Don't change the last line." He lay on the couch staring at that for a moment. Then he got up and made coffee from the in-room machine and stood at the window looking at Milwaukee waking up and went over his section one more time in his head. He wasn't sure he was ready. He was almost sure he wasn't. But somewhere in the gap between those two things, something small had shifted. Something about the quality of his doubt had changed. It was still there. It was just less loud than it had been yesterday. He wasn't sure what to call that. He decided to call it enough for now and got ready for the hardest morning of his professional life. The coffee from the in-room machine tasted like something that had made a sincere effort to become coffee and fallen short at the final moment. Liam drank it anyway, standing at the window in yesterday's shirt, watching a delivery truck idle at the intersection below while the driver checked his phone. Milwaukee at 6 in the morning had a particular stillness to it, not the aggressive quiet of a city that hadn't woken up yet, but something more settled, like a place that had made its peace with its own pace. He heard the shower stop. He moved away from the window, not because he needed to be somewhere else specifically, but because standing directly in front of the window when Ava Kensington walked out of the bathroom felt like a staging choice he hadn't been asked to make. He went to the desk instead and opened his notebook and pretended to review notes he had already reviewed 4 times. She came out dressed, fully, efficiently, as if she'd had a plan for every second of the last 20 minutes. Navy blouse, dark slacks, her hair damp at the ends but otherwise controlled. She was carrying her phone and reading something on it as she walked, and she glanced at him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was also clearly already operating in the part of the morning that involved the pitch. "Sleep okay?" she asked, moving to the desk to get her charger. "Well enough." "You fell asleep mid-paragraph. I wasn't sure if I should wake you." "Why didn't you?" She unplugged the charger and wound it efficiently around her hand. "Because you'd been rewriting the transition section for 2 hours, and rewriting it any further was going to make it worse." She glanced at him. "Your instincts are better when you're not thinking about them." He didn't entirely know what to do with that sentence, so he just nodded and poured a second cup of the bad coffee and offered it to her. She took it, looked at it, took one sip, and set it down with the expression of someone who had decided to accept the reality of the situation. "Patrick called at 6, she said. "Team is meeting in the lobby at 8. We need to leave for the Meridian offices by 8:45. "That's 3 hours. "Yes." She opened her laptop and sat down at the desk. "Go get breakfast. Real food, not this." She gestured at the coffee machine with a slight, almost invisible disdain. "You're going to need to be sharp, and you're not going to be sharp on a granola bar, and whatever that is." He was going to say he wasn't that hungry. He decided not to say that because she was right, and because somewhere in the last 8 hours something had recalibrated between them. Not dramatically, not in any way he could have pointed to specifically, but enough that arguing with her about breakfast felt like using energy that could go towards something more useful. He went down to the hotel restaurant and ordered eggs and toast and orange juice and sat at a corner table and ate it all, which surprised him a little. He'd expected his stomach to be too knotted to cooperate, but the food helped, and the orange juice helped, and the act of sitting still for 20 minutes with nothing in front of him that required input helped most of all. He thought about what she'd said the night before. Your best ideas come out when you're explaining yourself rather than presenting. He turned it over and looked at it from different angles. He'd heard versions of that observation before, people telling him to speak up more, to advocate for his ideas, to put himself forward. But those versions always felt like criticism wearing a motivational costume. What she'd said was different. It wasn't about volume or confidence as a performance. It was about something structural, about how he processed and communicated, about collapsing the distance between thinking and saying. He wrote in his notebook, "Don't explain what I'm presenting. Just say it like I'm explaining it to someone who needs to understand." Then he looked at that for a moment and crossed out "someone who needs to understand" and wrote "someone I trust." He wasn't sure why that felt more accurate. He put the pen down and finished his orange juice. By 8 o'clock, he was in the lobby. Patrick was already there, dressed in a suit that cost more than Liam's monthly grocery budget, and wearing the particular expression of someone managing competitive anxiety through aggressive positivity. The two account managers, Jess, who was thorough and quiet, and Devin, who was energetic in a way that was occasionally exhausting and occasionally genuinely useful, were both there with their laptops already open on the lobby table. "Big day," Patrick said when Liam approached. "Yeah. You're solid on your section?" "I'm solid." Patrick nodded, doing something with his jaw that suggested he was chewing over a thought he hadn't fully decided to release. "Listen, I just want to say, the transition into your segment, I was thinking we could soften it a little, make it more of a handoff than a shift. What do you think about Patrick?" Ava Kensington's voice came from behind them both. She was crossing the lobby toward them, bag over her shoulder, tablet in hand, moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who had decided the morning was already in progress. "The deck is finalized. We're not adjusting transitions in the lobby." She stopped at the table and looked at them. "Is everyone ready?" Devin said yes, with perhaps slightly too much enthusiasm. Jess said yes quietly and closed her laptop. Patrick said yes in the tone of a man rearranging his face into a different expression than the one he'd been wearing. Liam said nothing, which Ava seemed to take as confirmation. "The Meridian people are going to push on pricing in the Q&A," she said, setting her tablet on the table and looking at the group. "That's not new information, but I want everyone clear. We don't negotiate in the room. We hear the concern, we acknowledge it, we move on. If they want to negotiate, that conversation happens after, with me." She looked at Patrick. "Understood?" "Understood." She looked at Liam. He nodded. "The consumer messaging section is the emotional anchor of the pitch," she said. "Everything before it is framework. Everything after it is detail. The Meridian people need to feel something in the middle so the details have somewhere to land." She looked at Liam steadily. "That's your job." He held her gaze. "I know." She picked up her tablet. "Let's go." The cab ride to the Meridian offices took 11 minutes. Liam spent 9 of them looking out the window, and 2 of them in a quiet, internal negotiation with the part of his brain that was trying to generate catastrophic scenarios involving blank minds and silent rooms, and executives with the particular brand of skeptical patience that said, without words, "Convince me or stop wasting my time." He'd been in rooms like that before. He'd never been the person standing at the front of one. He thought about Sophie telling him the gecko story. The way she'd said, "Are you going to let me tell the story?" With that small, unrattled patience. He thought about Ava's post-it, "Don't change the last line." He thought about the transition section they'd rebuilt at midnight, and how when they'd finally gotten it right, he'd felt it the way he always felt a line of copy that was working. Not as a decision, but as a recognition. Yes. That's the thing. The cab pulled up to a glass building. They got out. Liam straightened his jacket and followed the group through the doors. The Meridian offices were on the 9th floor of a building that was trying hard to be contemporary and mostly succeeding. The lobby had exposed concrete and warm lighting and a reception desk staffed by a young man who confirmed their names with careful efficiency. They were brought to a conference room with a long table and a presentation screen and a view of the street below, and offered water and coffee. And then the Meridian people came in. There were 5 of them. The woman at the center was clearly the one who mattered. Mid-50s, silver-streaked hair worn short, the kind of composed attention that said she'd sat through many pitches and remained genuinely open to exactly one kind, the kind that was honest with her about what she was actually buying. Her name, according to the introduction, was Sandra Voss, Vice President of Marketing and Brand Strategy. Liam wrote it down. He had a habit of writing names down because he was terrible with them under pressure, and forgetting someone's name mid-presentation was the kind of moment that could destabilize everything that came after it. Patrick opened the pitch. He was good at openings. He had a fluid, anchored quality in front of a room, the kind that came from years of doing it and not flinching when things shifted slightly. He laid out the agency's record, the approach, the framework for the Meridian engagement. He was confident and he was clear, and he made it look, as he always did, like he wasn't working at all. Liam sat at the table with his notebook open and his pen uncapped and watched Sandra Voss. She was listening. She was engaged. But there was a slight quality to her engagement, attentive without being drawn in yet, like someone standing at the edge of a pool who hadn't yet decided to get in. Jess presented the campaign architecture with the methodical thoroughness that was her best quality. Devin handled the channel strategy and the media framework with the energy that made sense for that section, the numbers and the reach and the platform projections. Then Patrick said, "And now I'd like to hand over to Liam Carter, who'll walk you through the consumer messaging strategy and the brand voice framework." Liam stood up. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the speaker changes. A brief collective resettling, a polite reorientation of attention. Sandra Voss looked at him. The two people flanking her looked at him. The other two, who had been taking notes, looked up. He looked back at them. And for one very long second, which probably wasn't long at all in any objective measure of time, the part of his brain that generated catastrophic scenarios tried to make its move. It showed him the version of this moment that went wrong. The version where the words dissolved, where the careful architecture of everything he'd built in the last 4 days came apart in his hands. He let it run for that 1 second. Then he thought, "Don't explain what you're presenting. Say it like you're explaining it to someone you trust." He thought about Sophie asking him to stop listening to words and start listening to the story. He said, "I want to start with something that isn't in the deck." Sandra Voss's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree or two toward interest. "Most brand voice documents tell you who the customer is," Liam said. "Demographics, psychographics, spending patterns, behavior clusters, and all of that is in here. Jess covered the framework, and it's solid." He nodded toward Jess without looking away from Sandra. "But the thing that's easy to lose in all of that data is something simpler, which is, what does your customer feel in the moment they choose you? Not before, not after. In that moment." He clicked to his first slide. "The data says your ideal Meridian customer is a deliberate decision maker. They research. They compare. They take their time." He paused. "The mistake most brands make with that kind of customer is trying to accelerate them, create urgency, push them toward a decision faster than they want to move." He looked at Sandra Voss directly. "This isn't news to you." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "No," she said, "it's not. Because you've been that customer," he said. "We all have. We've all felt the difference between a brand that's trying to close us and a brand that's saying, 'You already know this is right. We're just confirming what you already suspected.'" He clicked to the next slide. "That's the distinction the Meridian consumer messaging is built around. Not persuasion, recognition." Sandra Voss leaned forward, almost imperceptibly. He kept going. He spoke for 9 minutes and 40 seconds, which he knew because he'd timed himself 6 times the night before. He went through the brand voice pillars with the framework they'd rebuilt at midnight, and when he got to the transition, the section that had been weak, the section they'd torn apart and reassembled, it landed the way a thing lands when it's finally right. Not with fanfare, just with the clean certainty of something that fits. He said, "The best brands don't make you feel like a customer. They make you feel like someone who made the right choice." He let it sit for exactly 1 breath. That's what Meridian already is for the people who know you. Our job is to make it feel that way for everyone else, before they've made the choice. He clicked off the final slide. The room was quiet. Sandra Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the woman beside her, her deputy, from what he could tell. And something passed between them that was rapid and professional and not for him to read. Then she looked back at Liam and said, "Walk me back to the recognition idea. How does that change the call to action language?" He felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. "I'll show you," he said. What happened over the next 40 minutes was not Liam's alone. Patrick handled the pricing question with exactly the measured deflection Ava had described. Devin answered a platform distribution question with the specificity it deserved. Jess produced a supplemental document that addressed a concern about timeline that Sandra Voss raised, and produced it so quickly that one of the executives across the table actually looked impressed by the preparation. Ava said almost nothing during the entire meeting. She sat at the far end of the table and watched, and occasionally wrote something in her notebook. And once, when a slightly confrontational question came from one of Sandra's colleagues, she answered it in 2 sentences that were so precise and so final that the room moved on without anyone fully registering how the conversation had shifted. But the room's temperature changed during Liam's section. He knew it. He'd felt it when Sandra Voss leaned forward, and felt it consolidating as the Q&A went on, the questions becoming less interrogative and more collaborative. Less convince me and more help me understand how this works in practice. By the end, Sandra Voss shook Liam's hand specifically before the general round of handshakes and said, "The recognition framework. I want to think about how that applies to the renewal customer segment. Can you put something together?" "Absolutely," he said. She nodded once, the way people nod when they've decided something, and moved on to Patrick. They walked out of the building at 12:15. The October air hit them as they came through the doors, and nobody said anything for the first 10 seconds, which was its own kind of answer. Then Devin said, "That was good. That was really good." Patrick said, "Sandra liked the messaging section." He said it neutrally, which from Patrick was the closest thing to generous acknowledgement that was available. Jess said, "She's going to call by Monday." It wasn't a question. Ava said nothing. She was looking at her phone, typing something brief. Then she looked up and glanced at Liam, and her expression was the contained, precise version of something that was not easy to name, but which Liam thought, standing on the sidewalk in the cold Milwaukee air, slightly disbelieving of his own morning, looked something like satisfied. Not "I told you so." Not even pride, exactly, which would have implied a kind of ownership she didn't seem to be trying to claim. More like, "There it is." Then she was walking, pulling out her phone to call for a cab, and the moment, whatever it had been, closed back around itself, and they moved on. They had lunch at a place around the corner from the Meridian building because Devin had looked it up and declared it had the best fish tacos in the city, a claim that nobody was in a position to verify, but which everyone decided to accept. The restaurant was small and loud with a lunch crowd, and they pushed 2 tables together and sat crammed into a space that was too small for 5 people with laptops and bags. And the discomfort of the physical arrangement seemed to release something in all of them that the morning's tension had been holding. Patrick ordered a beer, which was his way of signaling that the hard part was over. Devin talked about the look on the face of the man across from Sandra Voss when the supplemental document appeared. Like someone had produced it from actual thin air, I thought his eyebrows were going to leave his face. Jess smiled, which for Jess was the equivalent of laughing out loud. They talked about the pitch the way people talk about something they've survived together, with the particular mix of relief and analysis that comes when the thing is done and can finally be examined without the terror of consequence still attached to it. Patrick made a few notes about follow-up. Devin had already drafted a recap email on his phone. Jess identified 3 specific moments she'd want to refine for the written proposal. Ava ate her tacos and participated in the conversation in the minimal, observant way she participated in most conversations that were primarily logistical. She answered Patrick's questions about follow-up timeline. She confirmed Devin's instinct about a particular Meridian stakeholder being influential in the final decision. She asked Jess 2 questions about the supplemental document that were genuinely detailed, which made Jess visibly pleased without being visibly pleased about it, which was a very Jess kind of response. And once, when the conversation broke into 2 separate threads, Patrick and Devin discussing the proposal structure and Jess checking something on her laptop, Ava said to Liam quietly because they happened to be at the same end of the table. The question about the renewal segment. "Sandra's question," he said. "Don't underbuild it. She's going to come back to that specifically." She picked up her water glass. "She's been trying to solve that problem for 2 years. You gave her a language for it. That's worth more than you think." He looked at her. "I wasn't expecting her to respond to it that specifically." I was. She set the glass down. That's why you were in the room. He felt the weight of that sentence settle somewhere in him, not heavily, not like a burden, like ballast, something that steadied. You could have just told me that, he said. Before. I could have. She looked at him for a moment. Would it have helped? He thought about the train ride, the hotel lobby, the early morning at the desk going over his section one more time. He thought about all the versions of the morning he'd run in his head, most of which had gone badly in some specific and humiliating way. Probably not, he admitted. No, she said, and something at the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the neighborhood of one. You needed to find out you could do it by doing it, not by being told you could. He looked at the table for a moment. Is that why you pushed me to lead the section instead of just supporting Patrick? She was quiet for a second, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Yes, she said. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He wasn't sure he had one that would fit the space. The conversation at the other end of the table recombined around them, and the moment folded back into the general noise of the restaurant, and they ate. And Devin's assessment of the fish tacos turned out to be completely accurate. They took the 4:15 Amtrak back to Chicago. Liam sat in his seat with his headphones in and his notebook open, not writing anything for the first 40 minutes of the ride, just watching Illinois come back toward him through the window. Flat and brown and agricultural, the sky wide and pale with that particular quality of late afternoon October light that made everything look simultaneously vivid and almost gone. He thought about the moment in the conference room when Sandra Voss leaned forward. He replayed it. Not obsessively. He wasn't the type to obsessively replay good moments any more than he was the type to obsessively replay bad ones. But with the quiet attention of someone who wanted to understand exactly what had happened so he could locate it again. He'd said, "This is recognition, not persuasion." And something in the room had changed. And the thing was, he'd believed it when he said it. He hadn't been performing belief. He'd actually meant it because he knew it was true, because he'd felt it himself, because he was a person who made purchasing decisions slowly and deliberately, and from a position where the stakes of getting it wrong always felt higher than they probably were. And he'd spent years watching brands push and persuade and accelerate, and he knew from his own experience that none of that worked as well as the brands thought it did. He'd just said the true thing. That was all. And somehow, in 4 years of professional life at Kensington Creative, it had taken him until 9:45 on a Friday morning in Milwaukee to understand that saying the true thing, the actual true thing, without wrapping it in hedges or softening it for palatability, was itself a skill, not an accident of the right moment or the right room, a thing you could choose. He took out his pen and wrote one sentence at the top of a new page. You don't need the room to believe you. You just need to say the thing that's actually true. Then he put the pen down and watched the light change over the flat Illinois fields and let the train carry him back toward his ordinary life, which felt, for the first time in a long time, like something he'd chosen rather than something that had simply happened to him. He got home at 7:42. Mrs. Baxter had Sophie fed and bathed, which Liam hadn't asked for but was profoundly grateful for in the way he was always profoundly grateful for acts of care he hadn't thought to request. She's been asking about the trip every hour since 4 o'clock, Mrs. Baxter told him at the door while Sophie stood behind her with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had been asked to exercise great patience and was not finding it an easy request. How was it? Sophie said. This was directed at Liam with an intensity that suggested she needed a real answer, not the adult version where you said fine and changed the subject. It was good, he said. He thought about it. It was actually really good. She studied him for a moment with the careful attention of a 7-year-old who had learned early to read the gap between what grown-ups said and what they meant. Apparently satisfied, she uncrossed her arms. Did you bring anything back? Sophie, Mrs. Baxter said, with the gentle reproof of a woman who had been saying gentle reprimands for 68 years and had perfected the form. There's a cheese shop 2 blocks from the hotel, Liam said, reaching into his bag. Mrs. Baxter, I brought you the sharp cheddar you like. And this, he produced a small paper bag, is cheese that sounds disgusting but is apparently very good, according to the man at the counter. Mrs. Baxter accepted this with dignity. "And for you," he said to Sophie, producing a small paper bag from a different pocket of his bag. "The hotel gift shop had a stuffed animal that the front desk person told me was a Wisconsin dairy cow named Maple." Sophie took the bag, looked inside, and extracted a small brown and white stuffed cow with an expression of deep bovine calm. "Her name is already Maple?" she asked. "That's what the tag says." Sophie considered this philosophical complication, the question of whether a name given by a stranger could be overridden by personal preference. "I'm going to call her Maple the Second," she decided, "because my cow gets to be the real Maple." "You don't have a cow, Mom," Liam said. "I have her now." She held up the stuffed animal. He couldn't argue with that. He thanked Mrs. Baxter, took his daughter inside him, and put her to bed with Maple the Second, joining the pile that already contained Mr. Buttons and a stuffed penguin with no name that Sophie insisted didn't need one. He sat on the edge of her bed in the dark after she'd gone quiet, in the way he often did. Not because she needed him to, but because he did. Because the particular silence of a sleeping child was one of the steadiest things he knew, and some nights that steadiness was the thing he most needed to carry into the rest of the evening. Sophie said, half asleep, face pressed into the pillow, "Daddy." "Yeah, Bug." "Was the meeting scary?" He thought about the conference room, the long table, Sandra Voss leaning forward. "A little," he said. "But you did it anyway?" "Yeah." He smoothed the blanket at her shoulder. "I did it anyway." "That's what Mrs. Baxter says brave is," Sophie murmured. "Doing it when it's scary." He sat with that for a moment in the dark room. "Mrs. Baxter is pretty smart," he said. But Sophie was already asleep. He sat there a little while longer. The apartment was quiet around him. The good kind of quiet, the kind that felt earned. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and continuous. Inside, there was this, the small sound of his daughter's breathing, the faint glow of the nightlight in the corner, the stuffed cow settled in beside Mr. Buttons as if she'd always been there. He'd done it anyway. He got up carefully and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long time, not doing anything particularly, just existing in the space of the evening with the particular feeling that sometimes followed a day when something had shifted that you hadn't been trying to shift. Not elation, not the loud version of success that movies were full of. Something quieter, something that felt more like a door that had been stuck for a long time had finally, without drama, come open. He made tea he didn't really want and didn't drink it and went to bed at 10:30. For the first time in months, he didn't lie awake going over everything. He just slept. The call from Sandra Voss came on Monday. Liam was at his desk when it happened. Not his desk exactly, but the general vicinity of his desk, because he'd been making his third coffee of the morning and was walking back when he heard Devin say, loudly enough to be heard across half the floor, "Patrick, Sandra Voss is on line 2. The office did a thing offices do when something significant is happening nearby. It didn't stop exactly, but it slowed. People found reasons to be near the relevant desk. Keyboards went a little quieter. The particular frequency of attention shifted. Liam sat down and opened his document and pretended to read it. Patrick came off the call 11 minutes later. He walked directly to Ava's office, which itself was information, because Patrick had a habit of processing good news visibly before reporting it, the way some people need a moment alone with a good meal before sharing the table. And Liam watched through the glass wall as Patrick spoke, and Ava listened, and then wrote something on her notepad and asked what appeared to be 2 questions, and then nodded. Patrick came out. He looked at Liam across the floor with an expression that was doing a great deal of complicated internal work. Then he said, with a neutrality he was clearly constructing deliberately, "She's moving forward, wants a formal proposal by end of the month." Devin made a sound like a man who had been holding his breath since Friday. Jess said, "I'll start the proposal structure today." Rachel, from her adjacent desk, looked at Liam and raised her coffee mug a half-inch in the air, a gesture so small that most people wouldn't have read it as anything. Liam read it. He looked back at his document. Later that afternoon, Donna appeared at his desk with a meeting request from Ava for Tuesday morning. The subject line said, "Meridian follow-up and next steps." He confirmed it and went back to work. There was a particular quality to the week that followed the Milwaukee trip that Liam couldn't quite name. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the office. Not dramatically, not in any way that involved announcements or reorganization or any of the formal mechanisms through which professional change usually announced itself. It was subtler than that. It was in the way people made eye contact with him in the hallway, the way Devin forwarded him an article about brand voice strategy with a note that said, "Thought you'd find this relevant," which was the kind of thing Devin sent to people he considered peers rather than periphery. The way Patrick, in the Tuesday follow-up meeting, referred to Liam's recognition framework twice in front of Ava, which was not a thing Patrick would have said before Milwaukee, and which he appeared to say with the awareness that it was not a thing he would have said before. None of it was large, but all of it was real, and Liam noticed it the way he noticed most things. Carefully, without immediately knowing what to do with the information. What changed most noticeably was inside rather than outside. Something had loosened in his chest that week. Some constant, low-grade background pressure that he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped identifying it as pressure and had simply accepted it as the texture of being him. He'd gone into that Milwaukee conference room with it, that familiar weight of preemptive apology, the sense that he was taking up space he hadn't been properly authorized to occupy. And somewhere between the moment he said, "This isn't news, it's recognition," and the moment Sandra Voss leaned forward, the weight had changed. Not disappeared, but changed its character. He still doubted himself. That didn't stop. He'd rewritten the opening paragraph of the renewal segment 3 times before settling on a version he wasn't entirely confident in but believed was the honest one. He still had mornings where the alarm went off at 6:47 and the list of things he was managing felt stacked in ways that seemed architectural in their precariousness. Sophie's school schedule and the rent and the pitch deck and Mrs. Baxter and the fact that the building's boiler made a sound every night at 2 in the morning that he'd been meaning to report to the landlord for 6 months. But underneath all of that, something different now. A floor where before there'd been a drop. He was at his desk on Thursday morning, working on the renewal segment copy, when his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Baxter. "Sophie's school called. She has a 101 fever. Can you get her?" He was out of his chair before he'd finished reading the message. The thing about being a single parent in an office environment was that it required a particular kind of logistical fluency. The ability to reorganize the whole architecture of a day in the time it took to gather a jacket and a bag. He'd gotten better at this over 4 years. He knew which work could be done from home and which couldn't. He knew how to send a message that conveyed the situation without requiring explanation or apology. He knew, most importantly, how to be already mentally halfway to Sophie's school by the time he was physically still walking to the elevator. He sent an email to his team lead copying Patrick, explaining the situation and confirming he'd have the renewal segment draft in by end of day regardless. He stopped at Ava's assistant's desk on the way out. Dana, who had seen this particular kind of departure before and received it with the practiced efficiency of someone who processed all categories of human contingency. "Sophie's sick," he said. "I'll be working remotely. Everything on my desk is covered." Dana nodded. "I'll let her know." He was at Sophie's school in 22 minutes. She was sitting in the nurse's office in her coat, which someone had put on her, looking smaller than she usually looked and slightly more fragile and entirely uninterested in the small paper cup of water on the table beside her. She looked up when Liam came in and her face did the thing it did when she was sick, and she saw him. Not relief exactly, but a kind of release, like she'd been holding herself together for strangers and could now stop. "Hey, Bug," he said, crouching down to her level. "My throat hurts," she said, in the rough underwater voice of a fever. "I know." He felt her forehead, which was warm and dry. "Let's get you home." She walked out with one hand in his jacket pocket, which was what she did when she was sick, and didn't want to be seen holding his hand in the school hallway, but still needed the contact. He'd figured this out when she was 5 and never said anything about it. He got her home and settled on the couch with a blanket and a popsicle, red her preference, and a movie she'd already seen 4 times, which was another sick day preference, because familiar things felt safe when you felt bad. He made her drink water at regular intervals, which she accepted with the resigned compliance of someone who knew it was necessary but wasn't pretending to enjoy it. He took her temperature every 2 hours. He made chicken broth from a can. heated it to the exact temperature where it was warm enough to help, but not so hot it was uncomfortable, and she drank most of it. And between all of this, he worked. He wrote the renewal segment copy at the kitchen table while Sophie slept on the couch, his laptop open, the movie playing quietly in the background. He wrote and rewrote. He sent the draft at 4:58, 2 minutes before the end of business hours, which he recognized was probably not going to impress anyone in particular, but which mattered to him on some quiet level that was about something other than impression. He got a reply from Patrick at 5:15. Looks solid. We'll review with the team tomorrow. He got a second email at 5:47 that he almost missed because he was in the middle of Sophie's second dose of children's fever reducer and the logistics of convincing a 7-year-old that the grape-flavored medicine tasted better than it smelled. He saw it when he put his phone down on the counter and the screen lit up. It was from Ava Kensington. The subject line was blank. The body of the email said, "The opening paragraph of the renewal segment, the second sentence. Don't change it. AK." He stood at his kitchen counter and read that twice. Then he put his phone face down and went to check on Sophie. 2 weeks passed. The Meridian proposal took shape with the kind of collaborative momentum that happened when a team was genuinely energized by a project rather than just obligated to it. Liam found himself pulled into meetings he hadn't previously been part of. Patrick included him in a strategy session with Devin and Jess that ran 2 hours and covered ground that was, technically, beyond the scope of Liam's formal role. Nobody said anything about this. It simply happened, the way things happen when the informal structure of a place quietly reorganizes itself around where the useful thinking is actually occurring. He was careful about it. He'd seen people overreach in the wake of a good moment, treat one well-received presentation as a mandate for a different kind of standing. He didn't want that. He wanted to keep doing the work well and let the work make whatever case it was going to make. This was partly temperament and partly the hard-learned caution of someone who'd watched professional situations shift unpredictably enough times that he'd developed a respect for the fragility of momentum. But he was also, for the first time in a long time, genuinely excited about something at work. Not the performance of excitement, not the professional approximation of engagement. The real thing. The feeling of sitting down at his desk and wanting to open the document, of having ideas in the shower that he was irritated he couldn't write down immediately, of going home at the end of the day with the specific mental tiredness that comes from doing something you care about rather than something you're simply required to do. Sophie noticed. "You're different," she announced one evening, with the diagnostic bluntness unique to children who had been paying close attention. He was making dinner. Different how? "You're not thinking while looking." She had a whole vocabulary for states of adult distraction that she'd developed over years of observation. Thinking while looking meant the kind of distant expression that adults got when they were physically present and mentally somewhere else. "You're just looking." He considered this. "Is that better?" "Obviously," she said, with the air of someone who had been waiting a while for this development and was glad it had finally arrived. He laughed, which was the full-chest kind that surprised him a little. The third week of October landed cold and sharp, the kind of Chicago cold that didn't negotiate. Liam walked to the L in the mornings, with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets and his breath visible and his mind on the proposal, which was now at the stage where every day brought 1 or 2 new adjustments. Small refinements mostly, the kind that required more discipline than inspiration, because inspiration had already done its work, and what remained was craft. It was during this third week that he had a conversation with Rachel that he didn't expect. It was late, a Thursday, around 6:30, when the office had emptied to the skeleton population of people who stayed, not because they were performing dedication, but because they genuinely weren't done. Rachel was eating takeout from a container at her desk, which meant she was deep enough into something that leaving hadn't occurred to her. Liam was wrapping up a revision. They'd worked alongside each other in companionable near silence for the better part of 2 hours before Rachel said, without looking up from her screen, "Can I ask you something personal?" He glanced over. "Depends on how personal." "Not weird personal, just..." She poked at her food. "You seem different the past few weeks, like something changed, and I'm not asking you to perform some kind of growth narrative at me. I'm just asking if you're okay, because you seem okay, And usually when you seem okay, there's a reason that becomes apparent later when you're not. He looked at her. That's a very specific theory of me. I've been sitting 2 feet from you for 3 years. He turned back to his screen and thought about how to answer that honestly without either overstating it or dismissing it. I think I found out something about myself I'd been wrong about for a while, he said. Such as? That I was waiting for permission. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Permission from who? I don't know. The room, I guess. Whoever was in the room. He paused. I think I thought that if I was good enough at the work, eventually someone would notice and invite me to exist at a different level, like it would happen to me, rather than me making it happen. And Milwaukee changed that. Milwaukee made me say the thing I actually thought, in a room where it mattered, and it turned out the thing I actually thought was worth saying. He shrugged. That sounds simple. It's not simple, Rachel said. I've been working for 20 years and I still catch myself doing that, waiting to be called on. She stabbed a piece of broccoli. It's why people with worse ideas but louder mouths keep getting ahead. They don't wait. Marcus, Liam said. I didn't say Marcus. You were thinking Marcus. I'm always thinking Marcus, Rachel said in a tone that closed the subject. Then, after a moment, she picked the right person. For Milwaukee. He looked over at her. Kensington, she clarified. She knew what she was doing. I think so too, he said. I didn't, at the time. I thought it was a mistake. That's usually how it works, Rachel said. The person being chosen thinks it's a mistake. The person doing the choosing knows it isn't. She went back to her container. I've noticed things about her over the years, the way she watches people. She doesn't waste her attention. She paused again. She doesn't make random choices. Liam thought about the post-it on his notebook. Don't change the last line. He thought about the brief email at 5:47 on a Thursday when he'd been managing a sick child and a deadline simultaneously. The second sentence, don't change it. No, he agreed. She doesn't. He thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it meant to be on the receiving end of attention that didn't waste itself. He'd had bosses who were generous with positive feedback and bosses who were stingy with it, but he hadn't, until now, until Ava, had a boss whose specific attention felt like information rather than evaluation. She wasn't grading him, she was reading him. The distinction turned out to be enormous. The proposal was submitted to Meridian on October 29th, a Tuesday, via email from Patrick with Ava copied. The formal response came back the following Friday, a letter of intent to engage, subject to final contract negotiation, with a proposed start date in the new year. Devin printed the email and taped it to the office kitchen refrigerator. Nobody stopped him. Patrick Healy walked around the office with the energy of a man who had successfully landed something significant, which was fair because he had. He shook hands. He accepted congratulations. He said more than once that it had been a real team effort, which was also fair, and which he said with a conviction that Liam believed was genuine. Patrick was competitive and territorial about certain things, but he wasn't dishonest. At one point, crossing paths in the hall, Patrick stopped Liam and said, "The recognition framework." Sandra brought it up in the intent letter. By name. He said it the way someone delivers news that costs them something minor to deliver. She said it was the distinguishing element of the proposal. Liam said, "The team built the whole structure around it. It needed all the other pieces." Patrick looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "but you built the piece that made it stick." He nodded once, the kind of nod that ends a conversation and is also an acknowledgement, and moved on down the hall. Liam stood there for a second, then walked back to his desk. Ava's response to the letter of intent was efficient and contained. She sent a brief note to the team thanking them for the work and outlining next steps for contract finalization. She didn't throw parties, she didn't make speeches. She wrote 4 sentences that conveyed genuine recognition without performing it, which was, Liam had come to understand simply how she operated. Her approval was always measured, always earned, always real precisely because it was never automatic. But she stopped at his desk that afternoon, just for a moment. She was on her way somewhere. She was always on her way somewhere. And she paused and said, "The proposal introduction, the way you opened the renewal segment analysis. I want you to think about how that approach applies to the full campaign architecture. Not for this engagement, for your own development. She looked at him directly. You have a structural instinct that most writers don't develop. You should know that. He didn't deflect it. He held it. He said, "Okay." She nodded and kept walking. He turned back to his screen and sat with that for a while, not analyzing it, not wondering what it meant for the future, not trying to construct what should come next from it, just sitting with it, letting it be what it was, a specific piece of true information delivered without decoration by someone who did not say things she didn't mean. It was enough. It was more than enough. November came the way November always came to Chicago, decisively, with no interest in the calendar's technicalities. The city went gray and cold overnight, and the trees on Michigan Avenue shed their leaves in a matter of days, going from the last warmth of autumn color to bare branches almost without an intermediate stage, as if the city had decided to skip the gentle part and go straight to honest. Liam bought Sophie a new winter coat because she'd outgrown the purple one from last year, which was a discovery he'd made when she tried to zip it one morning and it stopped 4 inches short of the top, and she'd looked up at him with an expression of profound personal betrayal, as if the coat had done this deliberately. The new one was red. She approved. She wore it to school and came back still wearing it buttoned to the top, even though the classroom was 72 degrees inside. He was also, in this same period, beginning to understand that his professional life and his personal life were somewhat less separate than they'd been a month ago. Not in any dramatic or inappropriate way, but in the smaller sense that what happened at work was now sometimes actually interesting rather than just demanding. He came home with ideas still running. He talked about the Meridian Project with Mrs. Baxter one evening, explaining the recognition framework to her over tea, and she'd nodded slowly and said, "That's exactly how I chose my doctor of 30 years. I wasn't convinced by the certificate on the wall. I was convinced that he already understood what I was worried about before I said it." He'd looked at her and said, "I'm using that in the brand voice document," and she'd laughed and said he was welcome to it. He sent a revised passage to Ava at 9:15 that night with a single line of context. My neighbor described the recognition framework better than I did. Revised the anchor paragraph. Ava's reply came at 9:41. Stronger. Use it. That was November. Then came the morning in December that Liam Carter would remember for a long time afterward, not as the moment everything changed, because things had been changing for a while by then, gradually and without announcement, but as the moment he understood how completely and what it had cost someone else to make it possible. It started, as many bad mornings do, with something small going wrong. He was in the office early, 7:15, which was early even for him, but he'd woken at 5:30 with a revision to the campaign architecture document running in his head that he'd wanted to get down before it dissolved, and he'd written it at the kitchen table and then decided he might as well go in. The office was quiet at that hour. A few people from the overnight team, the coffee machine, the gray early light coming through the east-facing windows. He liked it like this occasionally. The emptiness of it, the sense of the place as a structure rather than a performance. He had his laptop open and his coffee, and he was working. At 8:43, Devin arrived. At 9, Jess. At 9:15, the rest of the floor began to fill. By 9:30, it was fully operational, all the ambient noise and motion of a creative agency midweek in early December. At 9:47, his laptop made the small sound it made when an application had encountered an error. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a moment without full comprehension, the way you look at a message that doesn't make immediate sense. Then he clicked on the error notification, and his stomach dropped with a cold, immediate certainty. The Meridian campaign architecture document, the master file, the one that contained the integrated framework, the final copy for all 6 campaign phases, the brand voice guidelines, the consumer messaging pillars, the renewal segment analysis, 4 months of work consolidated into a single source of truth document, had failed to save correctly the last time it synced. He clicked again, tried to open it from the backup location. Corrupted. He tried the version history. The last clean version was from 6 weeks ago, before the Milwaukee revisions, before the renewal segment, before the incorporation of the recognition framework in its finalized form, before, essentially, all of the most significant work. He sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, Then he opened the door on that catastrophic scenario generator in his brain and let it show him everything. The Meridian team expected the finalized campaign architecture document by end of week, not a draft, not a work in progress. The finalized version, ready for internal review before the engagement started in January. That was the agreement, confirmed in writing. Today was Wednesday. They had 2 days. He pulled up every file on his desktop, every email attachment, every shared drive folder. He went through each one with the focused desperation of a person who knows what they're looking for and is simultaneously dreading not finding it. He recovered fragments, sections from emails, older iterations of specific passages, a PDF export of an early draft that predated several significant revisions. He had pieces. He did not have the whole. He closed his eyes and breathed through his nose for 3 slow counts, which was a technique he'd developed during Sophie's worst sick nights, when the combination of exhaustion and worry made his brain want to spin out of useful function. He did not have the luxury of spinning out. He started making a list. What did he have? What he could reconstruct from email threads, what Devin might have in his own files, what Jess had kept, how long each section would take to rebuild, whether any of it could be recovered with IT help, whether the 6-week-old backup version could be built forward quickly enough. He was halfway through this list when he became aware that Ava Kensington was standing beside his desk. He hadn't heard her approach. She didn't make a lot of noise when she moved, which was something he'd noticed and had decided not to find unsettling. She was looking at his screen. "How bad?" she said. He told her. All of it, efficiently, without softening. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 2 questions. How much of the final version existed in email attachments or shared drives, and how much would need to be reconstructed from scratch? He gave her the honest numbers. She was quiet for a moment, not the catastrophic scenario kind of quiet, the organizing kind. "Get it on the corrupted file immediately," she said. "They may recover more than you think. While that's happening, pull Devin and Jess. Start reconstructing the sections you can't recover from attachments. You'll take the consumer messaging pillars and the renewal segment. Those are yours, and you'll rebuild them fastest. Devin takes the channel integration. Jess takes the framework structure." That's 3 people rebuilding 4 months of... You're not rebuilding 4 months. You're rebuilding the parts we can't recover from other sources. She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had already done the math. Most of the structural work exists somewhere in documentation. What's missing is the integrated version. That's less than you think. She looked at him. "Do you need me to believe this is possible, or do you already believe it?" He looked at the screen, at the list he'd been making, at the fragments he'd pulled together. "I already believe it," he said. "Then do it." He called Devin and Jess over. He explained the situation with the controlled precision of someone who had decided that panic was not a resource he could afford to spend. Devin's face did something complicated and then settled into the particular focused intensity he had when something was actually urgent rather than just pressing. Jess, characteristically, began making a list before Liam had finished explaining. It came back at 10:42 with partial good news. They'd recovered 60% of the corrupted file. Not clean, not usable as is, but recoverable in pieces with work. The missing 40% was distributed across the most recent revisions, the newest, most finalized material, the things that had been written last and saved most recently, and which the corruption had therefore damaged most completely, which meant the recovery was possible. It was also going to require something close to everything they had in the time they had. Liam worked through the morning without looking up. He reconstructed the consumer messaging pillars from memory and from email threads and from a draft he found in his own sent folder that he'd emailed to himself 6 weeks ago as a progress note. He rebuilt the renewal segment from his original notes, which he still had in his notebook, the physical notebook, with the pen-written draft he'd done on the train back from Milwaukee, because he was the kind of person who still wrote in physical notebooks and had never been more grateful for that fact than he was at 11:15 on a Wednesday in December. Devin worked the channel integration with the focused speed that was his best quality under real pressure. Jess rebuilt the framework structure with the methodical thoroughness that was hers. They shared files in real time, calling questions across the room when they needed to cross-reference. building the integrated version in parallel rather than in sequence, because there wasn't time for sequence. Ava appeared at intervals. Not hovering, she was running a company that had other things happening in it, but present enough that when she appeared, she could assess where they were and give a specific piece of direction or pull a resource if something wasn't moving fast enough. At 1:30, she stopped at Liam's desk and looked at his screen for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "The recognition framework anchor paragraph, the full version, with the neighbor's revision. Do you have it?" He pulled it up. "Here." She read it. "Where is it in the reconstruction?" "I put it back in section 4, same position as the final version." "Move it to section 2. It needs to anchor the whole document earlier. It's the thing that makes the rest of the detail make sense." He looked at the document, then at her, then back at the document. "You're right," he said, and moved it. She nodded and moved on. By 4 in the afternoon, the reconstruction was at 80%. By 5:30, 90. By 7:15, when the office had emptied around them and only Liam, Devin, Jess, and Ava remained, they were looking at a document that was complete, integrated, and, in certain sections, demonstrably stronger than the version that had corrupted, because the process of rebuilding had forced them to make active decisions about language that the original process had sometimes left as passive default choices. Devin leaned back in his chair and put his hands over his face and made a sound of pure exhausted relief. Jess saved the document in 5 separate locations, which was the kind of decision that required no discussion after the day they'd had. Liam read through the full document one last time, slowly, the way you walk through a structure you've just rebuilt to make sure the load-bearing elements are where they should be. He found 3 sentences he wanted to tighten. He tightened them. He found one paragraph that was still carrying too much hedging language from the early draft, and he cut it back to the sentence that was doing the actual work. He found one section heading that was wrong in a small way, too passive, too careful, and changed it to something that said the thing directly. He sat back. It was good. The corrupted version had been good. This version was better. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. Ava came out of her office at 7:40. She walked to where Liam was sitting, and he turned the laptop toward her without being asked. She read through the document for 8 minutes. He timed it because he had nothing else to do but wait, and the waiting was the hardest part. Then she looked up. "Send it to the Meridian team tonight," she said, with a note that the final integration required additional refinement and that you believe the result is a stronger document. Don't apologize. Don't explain the file corruption. We should tell them what happened. We should tell them that we delivered a better product than we initially proposed and that it's here 2 days ahead of the deadline. She looked at him steadily. The corruption was our problem to solve, and we solved it. That's all they need to know. He held her gaze. Thought about it. Okay. You write the note, she said. It should come from you. He looked at her. From me, not from Patrick. From you. She said it the way she said things that weren't debatable. You rebuilt that consumer section from memory in a notebook. Sandra Voss asked for more of your thinking specifically. This comes from you. He wrote the email. It took him 4 minutes. He read it twice, made one small change, and sent it. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed out a very long breath. Devin said from across the room, I'm going to go home and sleep for approximately 1,000 years. That's the most reasonable thing you've said all day, Jess replied, and began shutting down her laptop. Liam started gathering his things. His notebook, the one that had saved them, in its small paper way. He put in his bag with the particular awareness of a person who has learned that certain habits have more value than they look like they have. He put on his jacket. Ava was at the coat rack near the elevator when he got there, pulling on her own coat. They stood briefly in that adjacent silence that had developed between them over these weeks. Not uncomfortable, not charged, just present in the way of two people who had been through enough adjacent difficulty that the space between them had become familiar. Today was bad, he said. Yes, she agreed. It also turned out okay. It did. She pressed the elevator button. Not because it was a good day, because everyone in that room knew what they were doing and did it. He thought about Devin's speed and Jess's systematic thoroughness and the notebook in his bag and the neighbor's revision, and the way Ava had read the document for 8 minutes and come out knowing exactly where the anchor needed to move. "Yeah," he said. The elevator opened. They rode down in silence. In the lobby, they went in different directions. She had a cab waiting, he was walking to the L. He pushed through the glass doors into the December cold, which was sharp and immediate and entirely indifferent to whatever kind of day it had been. He put his hands in his pockets and walked. The city was its ordinary night self. Traffic and light and the sound of it all. The cold got inside his collar and he pulled it up. He passed a Thai place he and Sophie ordered from sometimes, a dry cleaner with a hand-lettered sign in the window, a woman walking a very small dog who appeared to be conducting a principled objection to the direction of travel. He thought about the document sitting in Sandra Voss's inbox right now, time-stamped 7:53 p.m., subject line, Meridian Campaign Architecture, Final Integration. He thought about the sentence he'd moved to Section 2, the thing that makes the rest of the detail make sense. He thought about Ava standing at the elevator saying, not because it was a good day, because everyone in that room knew what they were doing and did it. He got on the train, he found a seat, he rode back toward his neighborhood with the familiar motion of the L beneath him, the city visible through the window in its nighttime fragments. A lit window here, a street corner there, the brief bright gap of a crossing. He got home at 8:51. Mrs. Baxter had kept Sophie until 9 on the understanding that the day had been complicated, and Sophie was still awake, barely, sitting on the couch with Mr. Buttons and Maple II with the slow blinking expression of a child running on fumes who would be asleep in approximately 4 minutes once horizontal. "Was it a bad day?" she asked, the way she always asked, because she read him well enough to know when something had happened. "It started bad," he said, sitting down beside her. "It finished okay." She leaned against his arm. "Which one counts?" He put his arm around her and thought about that for a second. "The one you're sitting in at the end," he said. She thought about this for the 3 remaining minutes she had before sleep took her. Then, very quietly, barely audible, "That's good, Daddy." He held her until she was fully asleep and then carried her to bed and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his daughter in the dark. And the day was all around him still, in the specific exhausted residue that only the really hard ones leave behind. And he thought, yeah, that's good. Sandra Voss responded to the email at 6:40 the following morning. Liam saw it when he woke up. He'd developed the habit of checking his phone before getting out of bed, which he knew was not a healthy habit and which he maintained anyway because the alternative was lying awake wondering. The email was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph confirmed receipt of the campaign architecture document and said the Meridian team would complete their internal review by Monday. The second paragraph was shorter, and it was the one that made him sit up. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to schedule a call specifically with you before we finalize the engagement terms. The recognition framework and the renewal segment analysis raise some strategic questions I'd like to think through with the person who built them. Please coordinate with my assistant for a time next week." He read it twice, then put his phone face down on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling, at the water stain shaped like Ohio, and breathed slowly for a moment. Sophie was already up. He could hear her in the kitchen, the small sounds of a 7-year-old attempting self-sufficiency, the particular scrape of the step stool she used to reach the cereal shelf, the rattle of the cabinet, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. He lay there listening to it and thought about the email. Sandra Voss wanted to talk to him specifically, not to Patrick, not to Ava, to the person who built the framework. He got up and went to the kitchen, where Sophie had successfully poured herself a bowl of cereal and was now engaged in the apparently difficult challenge of opening the milk carton, which she was approaching from 3 different angles with the systematic determination of someone who refused to admit a problem was beyond her. "Let me," he said. "I almost have it. You've been almost having it for a while." "That's not—" The carton opened. She looked at it. "See? Well done," he said. She poured the milk with the concentration of a surgeon and then looked up at him. "You have a face." "I always have a face. A different face. A thinking face." He poured his coffee and told her about the email in the way you explain professional things to a 7-year-old. Simplified but not condescending, because Sophie had a reliable radar for condescension, and found it deeply offensive. He told her a woman from a big client wanted to talk to him specifically because she liked his ideas. Sophie considered this while eating her cereal. Then, "Is that good?" "Yeah," he said, "that's good." "Then why do you look like it's also a little bit scary?" He thought about that honestly. Because sometimes good things and scary things are the same thing. She processed this for a moment. "Like when I wanted to try the diving board," she said. "Exactly like that." "I did it, though." "You did." She went back to her cereal, apparently satisfied that this established the necessary precedent for how the situation should be handled. He forwarded the email to Ava with a brief note. Her reply came 40 minutes later while he was on the L. "Take the call. You don't need to loop me in unless she raises contract terms. The strategic conversation is yours." He held his phone and looked at those two sentences for a long time. The strategic conversation is yours. He'd been at Kensington Creative for 4 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd had a direct client relationship, one that wasn't filtered through a senior account director, one that wasn't mediated by someone with more tenure and more formal standing. The structure of the firm was such that copywriters wrote and account directors managed, and the creative work flowed upward through layers of review before it ever reached a client's direct attention. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked for him. And now Ava Kensington was telling him that a client conversation, a strategic, relationship-defining conversation with the VP of marketing and brand strategy of a company that was about to become the firm's largest account, was his to have without supervision. He stared out the train window at the passing city and thought about what that meant, not in terms of status or title or any of the formal professional measurements, just what it meant in terms of what she believed about him. She believed he could handle it. She believed he wouldn't need her in the room. That was, he was beginning to understand, the thing about Ava Kensington's confidence in him. It wasn't performative. It wasn't the kind of encouragement that consisted of general positive statements about potential. It was structural. It showed up in decisions, in who got on which train, in whose name went on which email, in who was told the strategic conversation is yours and meant it. He put his phone in his pocket and got off at his stop and walked the 2 blocks to the office building and pushed through the glass doors and rode up to the 14th floor and sat down at his desk and started working. The call with Sandra Voss happened the following Tuesday. Liam took it at the small conference table near the windows. Not conference room B, not anywhere formal, just a table with decent light and a door that closed. He'd prepared for it the way he'd prepared for Milwaukee, which was to say thoroughly and with the specific anxiety of someone who cared about getting it right, running the possible directions of the conversation in his head until he knew the territory well enough to navigate it without a map. Sandra was direct and unhurried. She asked about the recognition framework, where it had come from, how it had been developed, what assumptions it was built on. She asked about the renewal segment specifically, what had led him to approach it the way he had, whether the framework was extensible to segments beyond the renewal customer. She asked questions that were intelligent and somewhat demanding, and that required him to think carefully rather than just recall, which was the kind of conversation he'd always found easier to sustain than the purely social kind. At one point she said, "You describe the Meridian customer as a deliberate decision maker who researches before committing. How did you arrive at that as the central framing rather than, say, a value-driven consumer?" He thought about it for a second. The honest answer. Because value-driven is a disposition. It tells you what someone cares about. Deliberate decision maker is a behavior. It tells you how they act on what they care about. The campaign has to meet them at the behavior level, or it doesn't reach them at all. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the clearest articulation of that distinction I've heard in 2 years of agency conversations." "I appreciate that," he said. And then, because he'd been thinking about what Ava had said, collapsed the distance between thinking and saying, he added, "It came from a personal place. I make decisions that way. I know what the experience is from the inside." "That's why it lands," she said simply. "People can tell when someone's speaking from knowledge versus speaking from research. Those are different things, and the difference is audible." He wrote that down. He wrote it down right there, in the middle of the call, because it was true and he wanted to remember it exactly. The call ran 40 minutes. When it ended, he sat at the small table for a while without moving, looking at his notes. His handwriting was slightly worse than usual, which happened when he was thinking faster than his hand could keep up. He had a professional relationship now with the VP of Marketing and Brand Strategy of a major client, not mediated, not supervised, his. He didn't quite know what to do with that yet, but he recognized it as something. He went back to his desk and worked through the afternoon and didn't mention the call to anyone except Ava, to whom he sent a brief summary. 2 paragraphs, the main topics covered, Sandra's key questions and his responses, the areas she wanted to develop further in the engagement. He wrote it the way he was learning to write everything, with the true thing first, without hedging. Ava replied in 3 words, "Good, keep going." December moved forward the way December does in cities, faster than it should, under the specific pressure of all the things a month end implies. The Meridian engagement was formally confirmed on December 14th. The contract was signed. The start date was set. The agency celebrated in the way creative agencies celebrate large wins. Lunch brought in, a brief and slightly awkward gathering in the kitchen area, someone opening a bottle of something that was fancier than the paper cups it got poured into, deserved. Patrick gave a short speech that was generous and accurate about the team's work. He mentioned Liam by name twice, which was both notable and, Liam thought, genuinely meant. Rachel caught his eye from across the kitchen and made a small face that was not quite a smile, but was in that general neighborhood. Ava said a few words that were brief and real and did not include the phrase going forward or synergy or any of the other linguistic furniture that tends to accumulate at moments like this. She thanked the team. She said the Meridian engagement was the beginning of a different kind of work for the agency, not just a larger account, but a different way of thinking about what the agency was for. She said this with the particular quality she brought to things that mattered to her. Not heightened, not performed, just present. Then she left the kitchen because she had a 3 o'clock. Life settled into a new rhythm in the weeks that followed. The Meridian work started in January, structured, demanding, with the particular quality of a long-term engagement where the pressure wasn't the acute crisis kind, but the sustained kind, the kind that required consistency over weeks and months rather than brilliance in a single afternoon. Liam found that he was good at the sustained kind too. He'd been managing sustained pressure in his personal life for years. The professional version turned out to use the same muscles, just pointed in a different direction. He had regular calls with Sandra Voss. He developed a working vocabulary with her team. The account director on the Meridian side, the brand manager, the internal strategist who had a habit of asking the kind of questions that sounded simple and weren't. He learned how to manage those relationships in real time, which was different from learning how to write for them. He made mistakes. He said something in one call that was imprecise in a way that required clarification in the next, and he handled the clarification by being direct about what he'd meant and how he'd said it wrong, and the Meridian account director said afterward, somewhat to Liam's surprise, that she appreciated how he handled it. "Most people get defensive when they misspoke," she told him. "You just fixed it." "It was wrong," he said. Fixing it seemed more useful than defending it. She laughed. "I've been in this industry for 15 years, and that's not as common as you'd think." He thought about that for a while afterward, about how much energy he'd spent in his life, defending positions he'd already privately conceded because backing down felt like losing something. He thought about how much cleaner it was to just say the true thing, including the true thing about having gotten the previous thing wrong. That was February. March was when everything changed. It happened on a Thursday, not a Monday, not a dramatic beginning of week turning point, just an ordinary Thursday in the middle of March, when the Chicago cold was finally beginning to consider releasing its grip and the ice on the sidewalks was doing that half-thawed state that was worse than either full ice or clear pavement because it required constant attention. He was called into Ava's office at 2:15. This happened occasionally now, and it no longer generated the same quality of uncertainty it once had. He'd been in her office enough times in the past months to have a normal relationship with the space, to know that she kept her desk organized in a way that looked sparse but wasn't, that she had a framed photograph on the credenza behind her that he'd never looked at directly because it felt like an intrusion, that she always had coffee, but it was usually cold by the time she drank it because she kept forgetting it in the middle of something else. He sat across from her. She was looking at her desk rather than at him, which was unusual. She had a folder in front of her, a physical folder, which was also unusual in a world where everything was digital. She looked up when he sat down, and her expression was one he recognized as the one she wore when she was going to say something that required her to think carefully about how to say it, which was not an expression he'd seen on her often because Ava Kensington was not typically a person who struggled to find language for things. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I've been considering when and how to tell you this for a while, and I've decided that the right time is now and the right way is directly." He didn't say anything. He waited, the way she had taught him to wait by example, without filling the space. She opened the folder. "When you first became a single father," she said, "Sophie was 4 months old. You'd been at the firm for 6 months." He went still. "The situation at the time was that you'd taken bereavement leave and then returned to work under circumstances that were complicated, practically speaking. You were managing an infant, you'd lost your partner, and you were in a junior role with no particular safety net." She looked at him steadily. "The leadership at the time raised the question of whether your position was sustainable, whether the circumstances were going to affect the work in ways that the firm couldn't absorb." The office was very quiet. "My father was running the firm then," she said. "I was in a senior strategy role. I was not in a position to make personnel decisions directly." She paused. "I was, however, in a position to be in the room when they were made." He looked at her. He didn't know what was on his face. He didn't know what he was feeling exactly, because there were several things happening at the same time, and they didn't yet have a clear order. "They were going to let you go," she said. "The argument was that your situation was too unstable for the demands of client work and that the firm needed people who could be fully present." That was the language. She said the last 2 words in a way that made clear what she thought of the language. "I disagreed." The silence lasted a few seconds. "What did you say?" he asked. His voice was level. He was making it level. "I said that the work you'd submitted in your first 6 months was stronger than most of the work we were getting from people who'd been here for years, and that the correct response to a talented employee in a difficult circumstance was not to compound the difficulty." She closed the folder. "I also said that if the firm let go of people who were struggling through genuinely hard circumstances, we were the kind of company that didn't deserve the talent it was trying to attract." He absorbed that. "My father agreed with me," she said. "He overruled the recommendation." Liam looked at the folder on her desk, then back at her. "You saved my job," he said. "I argued for your position," she said. "There's a difference. I wasn't in a position to save anything. I was in a position to make a case, and I made it." "That's the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe." He sat with the information. He tried to locate it in the timeline of his life. Sophie at 4 months, the purple hospital bracelet that he'd kept in his desk drawer for 2 years because throwing it away had felt wrong. The return to work, which he remembered as a long gray period of doing what needed to be done while the rest of himself was somewhere else, not entirely present, doing some internal processing that he hadn't had language for at the time. The feeling of vulnerability he'd carried into the office every day, carefully hidden under the professional surface. He'd thought, during that period, that he was holding on by performing competence well enough that nobody noticed the gap between the performance and the person performing it. He hadn't known that someone had noticed, had seen through the performance to the actual person underneath it, had decided the actual person was worth keeping. "There's more," Ava said. He looked at her. "About 8 months after that, Sophie was sick, a respiratory thing. She was in the hospital for 3 days. You used your sick leave, but it wasn't enough coverage, and you were going to have to take unpaid time." She said this evenly, not making it larger than it was. "I arranged for you to have access to the firm's emergency family support fund. It was a discretionary allocation. It required a senior approval. You were never notified of it formally because the fund's protocol allowed for confidential disbursement in cases where notification might create discomfort." He stared at her. He remembered that hospital stay. He remembered the specific terror of it. Sophie small and struggling in a hospital bed, the pediatric ward with its particular institutional smell, the 3 nights he'd slept in a chair beside her bed because leaving felt impossible. He remembered the financial panic that had run underneath the fear, like a parallel channel, The mental arithmetic he'd been doing about how many unpaid days he could absorb before the math stopped working. And he remembered that the math had worked out. He'd never fully understood how. He'd assumed he'd miscalculated in his initial panic, that the numbers had been better than he thought. He'd been so relieved by the outcome that he hadn't examined the mechanism too carefully. "That was you," he said. "That was a fund that exists for exactly that situation," she said. "I made sure you qualified for it and that the paperwork went through." "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. This was, he was beginning to understand, a question she'd thought about. "Because you were already carrying enough. And because—" She paused. "Because the kind of support that works best isn't always the kind that comes with an acknowledgement attached to it. Sometimes it's just the problem being solved and the person being allowed to keep going without having to feel grateful to someone in a power position above them." She looked at him directly. "Gratitude in a professional hierarchy is complicated. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something. I wanted you to be able to keep doing the work." He thought about the word hierarchy, about the 4 years of careful professional distance he'd maintained, about the way he'd existed in this building as someone who was grateful to be here at all, who had never quite felt he had the standing to take up more space. He thought about how different that feeling might have been if he'd known. "There's one more thing," she said. He wasn't sure his system could process one more thing. He said nothing. "A year ago, last March, the account restructuring." She held his gaze. "When the firm reorganized 3 of the major account teams, there was a proposal to consolidate the copywriting function into a centralized pool, reduce headcount, redistribute the work." A pause. "Your position was on the list for review." "I didn't know there was a restructuring review," he said. "Most people didn't. It was an internal leadership conversation that didn't go beyond the executive team." She opened the folder again and turned one page toward him. He could see a document, a memo of some kind with his name visible in the first paragraph. "I blocked it. I presented an alternative structure that preserved all the individual writer positions and made the case that centralized copywriting pools produce generic output for agencies that are trying to differentiate on voice and authenticity." She paused. "The alternative structure was adopted. The review was closed." He looked at the document, at his name in the first paragraph, at the date at the top of the memo, which was 14 months ago, 3 months before the Milwaukee trip, 3 months before Ava had chosen him for the trip. He looked up. "Why are you telling me this now?" She held his gaze. "Because something is coming that you need to make a decision about, and I think you can't make it clearly without knowing this." She closed the folder. "And because you've earned the right to know it, you've spent 4 years here not knowing the full story of your own tenure, and that's not fair." He sat back in his chair. The city was visible through her office window, a portion of it gray and cold and ongoing. He looked at it without really seeing it. He was doing something interior that didn't have a clean name, not processing exactly, not feeling exactly, something between the two, something that involved taking a set of years and understanding them differently than he'd understood them while living inside them. He'd thought he was surviving on his own. He'd thought the years had worked out through some combination of his own effort and ordinary professional circumstance and luck. He hadn't been entirely wrong. The work was his, the effort was his. The nights at the desk and the mornings and the trying and the staying were all his. But they'd happened inside a container someone had been quietly maintaining. He thought about Ava at 30, 2 years younger than him in a senior strategy role, not yet the CEO, watching the leadership discuss an employee she'd barely met and deciding he was worth arguing for, making the case, using whatever standing she had. He thought about the hospital fund paperwork going through without his knowledge, some administrative act executed in the background of his worst week, the problem solved before he knew someone had solved it. He thought about the restructuring memo with his name in the first paragraph. "You said something is coming," he said, "that I need to make a decision about." She nodded. "There's an offer from a company called Vantage Group based in London. They're building a creative division from the ground up, a North American office based in Toronto. They need someone to lead the consumer strategy and brand voice function." She looked at him steadily. "The recruiter reached out to me 3 weeks ago. I'm telling you because the role would be a significant step. Director level, team of 8, genuine leadership scope. And because I think you're ready for it. He looked at her. You're recommending me for a position at another company. I'm telling you a position exists and that I believe you're qualified for it. What you do with that information is your decision. But you think I should take it? She was quiet for a moment. I think you should consider it seriously. I think the version of you who walked into that Milwaukee conference room 9 months ago would have assumed it wasn't for him without letting himself properly find out. She held his gaze. I don't think you're that version anymore. The room was quiet. Through the window, the city continued. If I take it, he said, I leave Meridian mid-engagement. The Meridian engagement can be transitioned. That's a solvable problem. And you'd need to replace me. Yes. That's difficult for you? It's manageable, she said. That's not the question you should be asking. He looked at the folder. What's the question I should be asking? She held his gaze for a moment. Whether this is the life you want to be living in 5 years, and whether the decision you make now puts you closer to it or further from it. He sat with that, Sophie's voice in his head. Which one counts? The one you're sitting in at the end. Can I think about it? He said. Of course. She stood, which was her way of signaling the formal part of the conversation was complete. Take the week. He stood too. He moved toward the door and then stopped. He turned back. Ava. It was the first time he'd used her first name directly. Not Ms. Kensington, not the ambient professional address that wasn't really address. Her name. She looked at him. Why did you argue for me? When I'd been here 6 months and you barely knew my work. She thought about it. She was someone who thought before she answered, and he'd learned to respect the pauses. I read 3 pieces of work you'd submitted in your first weeks, she said. One was a brand positioning brief. One was a tagline document. One was a piece of web copy for a retail client that nobody was paying much attention to. She paused. The web copy had a line about how good design makes you feel understood rather than sold to. It was in the middle of a paragraph about user experience. It didn't need to be there. You put it there because you believed it. He said nothing. People who believe things, she said, are rarer than people who know things, and they're worth more trouble. She looked at him with the contained, direct quality that was just hers. That's why. He nodded. He wasn't sure he could say anything that wouldn't be inadequate. He went back to his desk. He sat there for a long time without opening his laptop. Rachel was eating lunch at her desk, not looking at him. Devin was on a call, his voice low and specific. The office went on around him in its ordinary way, the way it had gone on every day for 4 years, the way it had been going on during the 6 months when he was barely holding himself together, and a woman in a senior strategy role had decided without telling him that he was worth the argument. He thought about the web copy, the line about feeling understood rather than sold to. He barely remembered writing it. He remembered caring about the project, which had been a small one, not consequential in any formal sense, just a thing that needed doing. He'd put the line in because it was true, and because the paragraph was better with it. That had been seen, not just noted, seen. Seen by someone who understood what it meant for a person to put something true in a piece of work, not because they needed it there professionally, but because they couldn't help it. He opened his laptop eventually. He stared at the document on his screen for a while. Then he typed a note to himself in his personal folder, the one he kept separate from work files. You were never as alone as it felt. He looked at that for a moment. Then he closed the folder and went back to work. That evening, he picked Sophie up from school himself. A Wednesday thing that he'd protected from scheduling encroachment for 4 years. The one reliable middle-of-the-week constant that was entirely theirs. She came out of the school in her red coat with her backpack bouncing and Mr. Button stuffed into the side pocket of it, which was his travel configuration. Art today? He asked, falling into step beside her. We made clay things, she said. Mine was supposed to be a bowl, but it's more of a general shape. Artistic interpretation. Mrs. Romano said it had expressive form. That's a compliment. I think so too. She took his hand, which she did without ceremony when she was tired and the day had been long enough. Daddy. Yeah. If you found out that someone had been helping you for a long time without telling you, she said, with the slightly too casual tone of a child who had been thinking about how to ask something, would you be mad? He looked down at her. Who have you been helping without telling me? No one. It's a question. He thought about it honestly. I think I'd feel a lot of things, but I don't think mad would be one of them. What things? Grateful, he said, and maybe a little, I don't know, humbled, like finding out you'd been underestimating how much someone cared. She walked beside him for a moment, thinking about this. Would you want to know? Yes, he said. I think knowing changes things. In a good way. How? He thought about it. About the memo on Ava's desk. About the hospital fund paperwork. About a woman in her late 20s in a strategy role deciding a junior writer she barely knew was worth arguing for. It changes how you understand the past, he said, and that changes how you see the future. Sophie processed this. That's kind of complicated. Yeah, he agreed. But good complicated or bad complicated? He squeezed her hand. Good complicated, he said. Definitely good. They walked the rest of the way home in the early evening light. Sophie talking about the general shape that was also a bowl. Liam listening, really listening, story and all, the way she'd asked him to. And somewhere beneath all of it, in whatever part of him processed things that couldn't be processed in real time, the day's revelations were settling. Not into order exactly, into something more honest than order. He'd been seen for years by someone who didn't tell him she was looking. He'd been protected by choices he didn't know had been made. He'd built his own capability inside a structure someone had quietly maintained when it was under threat. None of that diminished the work. None of it took anything from the nights at his desk or the Milwaukee conference room or the notebook that had saved them in December. Those were still his. But they'd happened inside something, inside a set of decisions made by another person who'd believed in what he was before he'd believed in it himself. He thought about the job offer. London, Toronto. Director level. A team of 8. He thought about Ava's question, whether this is the life you want to be living in 5 years. He thought about Sophie beside him in her red coat, talking about expressive form, Mr. Buttons bouncing in the backpack, the evening light coming through the gaps between buildings at the particular angle that meant winter was actually, finally, starting to let go. He didn't have an answer yet, but he had something better than an answer. He had an honest question, which he'd been asking of himself all evening, and which he was finally, after years of flinching away from the version of it that felt too large, willing to sit with until it told him something true. What did he want his life to look like? Not what could he reasonably expect. Not what was realistic given everything. Not the careful, pre-apologized version of wanting that he'd spent years practicing, the real thing, the actual answer. He didn't know it yet, but for the first time, he was asking. He took the week she gave him. He didn't make lists. He didn't build a pros and cons column on a legal pad the way he usually approached large decisions. That careful defensive architecture of reasons designed to justify a conclusion he was too cautious to reach directly. He'd done that for years, made the lists, weighed the columns, arrived at the safe answer and told himself it was the rational one. This time he just lived with the question. He let it sit beside him on the L in the mornings, and at the kitchen table in the evenings, and in the chair beside Sophie's bed after she fell asleep. He didn't push it for an answer, he just let it be present, the way you let a difficult conversation sit in the room after it's happened, giving it the space to settle into something you can actually see. He talked to Mrs. Baxter on Friday evening, not about the decision specifically. He started there but ended somewhere else, the way conversations do when the person you're talking to is genuinely listening. She made tea. She sat across from him at her kitchen table, which was covered in the organized clutter of a woman who read 4 books simultaneously and kept a crossword puzzle going at all times and had strong opinions about the correct way to fold a dish towel. She listened to him describe the offer. London, Toronto, director level, team of 8. And she didn't say anything while he talked, which was one of the things he most valued about her. She didn't start composing her response while he was still speaking. She actually waited. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What does Sophie think?" she asked. "I haven't told her yet, not the specifics." "Why not?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Because I didn't want to get her excited about something I might not do. Mrs. Baxter looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior and has learned to recognize its patterns. Or, she said, because you didn't want to have to explain to her why you decided not to do it. He looked up. You already know what you want to do, she said. You've known since she told you about it. You're spending the week giving yourself permission. He looked at his coffee cup. The thing about Mrs. Baxter was that she was almost always right, and the rightness of it had an immediacy that didn't allow for much argument. Toronto is far, he said. It's a 1-hour flight. Sophie has school here, friends, her routine. Children are more adaptable than their parents give them credit for, she said, and less fragile. She picked up her tea. What you're really asking is whether you're allowed to want something large. Whether the wanting itself is okay, given everything. He was quiet. It is, she said simply. That's the answer. He drove home in the kind of quiet that comes after a thing has been said that needed saying. He put Sophie to bed. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and the cursor blinking in an empty document and thought about what Ava had said. The version of you who walked into that Milwaukee conference room 9 months ago would have assumed it wasn't for him. He thought about the note in his personal folder. You were never as alone as it felt. He typed, I'm going to take it. He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed and slept without the ceiling staring that had preceded every other major decision of his adult life. He told Sophie on Saturday morning. He made her pancakes first, not as a bribe exactly, but because he wanted the conversation to happen in the context of something ordinary and good, something that said, this is still our life, even as he was about to tell her it was going to change shape. He made the ones with the blueberries she liked, and she ate 3 of them with the focused pleasure of a child for whom Saturday breakfast was a serious institution. Then he set his fork down and said, I need to tell you something about work. She looked up. She had a small blueberry on her chin that she was apparently unaware of. I've been offered a different job, he said, a bigger one. Leading a whole team in a different city. What city? Toronto. She looked at him carefully. Is that in America? Canada. About an hour's flight from here. She was quiet, processing. Sophie's processing looked like stillness. She went very still when she was thinking hard about something, like all available energy was being redirected inward. Would we move? She said. Yes. Would we leave Mrs. Baxter? He felt that question in a specific place. We'd visit, and she could visit us. He paused. It would be different. She looked at her plate, then back at him. Is it a good job? It's a really good job, Bug. Do you want it? He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, at her serious face, at the blueberry on her chin, at the 7-year-old gravity she brought to the question as if she understood that it mattered, and that she should treat it accordingly. Yeah, he said, I really do. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, Okay. Okay? You said brave is doing it when it's scary. She picked up her fork. So you should do it. She pointed at him with the fork in the absent, authoritative way she had. But I want a really good school. With art. I'll find one with art, he promised. And I want to bring Mr. Buttons and Maple II. Obviously. And Mrs. Baxter has to come visit before Christmas. I'll ask her. Sophie appeared to find this satisfactory. She went back to her pancakes. Liam sat across from her and felt something in his chest that was too large to name precisely. Not just relief, not just love, not just the particular gratitude of a parent whose child has just given them the exact right answer without knowing how much it was needed. Something that included all of those and was also its own separate thing. His daughter was going to be okay. More than okay. He thought she probably always had been. He sent the email to Ava on Sunday night. Formal, brief, honest. He was accepting the Vantage Group offer. He wanted to handle the Meridian transition responsibly and would work whatever timeline the firm needed. He thanked her for telling him about the offer and for the conversation that preceded it. He read it 4 times and then sent it before the 4th time could become a 5th. Her reply came Monday morning, before he reached the office. I expected this. We'll work out the transition. Come see me at 10. He was at her office at 10 exactly. She was at her desk and she looked up when he came in and gestured at the chair, and he sat. 6 weeks, she said. That's the transition I need. Meridian handoff, documentation of the consumer strategy framework, time to bring someone up to their role. 6 weeks is fine. I'll be honest, there isn't someone on the current team who replaces what you do in the way you do it. She said this without softening or inflection, pure information. But that's a problem for me to solve, not a reason for you to stay. He nodded. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to be good at this, she said. The leadership part, the building a team part. You understand how people work. You see what they're capable of before they do. She paused. That's the most useful thing a leader can have. He held that. He thought about where that quality had come from, not from ambition or from studied management theory, but from years of being on the other side of it. Years of being the person whose capability existed before anyone had named it. Years of needing someone to see it and say so. I learned that from watching you, he said. She looked at him directly. I know, Set, she said. That was the point. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The city was visible through her window, the same window he'd looked through months ago when she told him everything, the same gray ongoing city that had been the backdrop to all of it. I want to say something, he said. She waited. I know you didn't do any of it for gratitude. I know that wasn't the point, and you've told me that, and I believe you. He held her gaze. But I'm going to say it anyway, because it's true, and I think you should hear it. What you did, all of it, not just Milwaukee, all of it, it mattered. It changed the course of things. For me and for Sophie. He paused. I don't know who I would have become if those first few years had gone differently. I know they didn't, and I know that's partly because of choices you made when you didn't have to make them. That's just true. And I wanted you to know I know it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in this measured way she said things that cost her something, you would have been fine. You would have found another way. Maybe, he said, but I found this one. And it mattered. She looked at the window, then back at him. Her expression was the contained version of something he didn't have a full read on. Not the professional face, not the CEO face, something underneath both of those. I watched my father build this company for 30 years, she said finally. And the thing he told me once, the only piece of advice he ever gave me about people, which was that he was very bad at advice, was that the best investment you can make is in someone who cares about the work more than they care about being seen caring about it. She paused. You were the easiest case I ever made. He didn't say anything. Some things were better received in silence than in response. Go do good work, she said. And she turned back to her desk, and the conversation was over, and he walked out of her office for what he understood might be one of the last times as an employee, and went back to his desk to start figuring out how to hand it all over properly. The 6 weeks were full in the way that endings are always full, denser than the time preceding them, every day carrying the weight of things being done for the last time, even while new things were being set in motion. He documented the consumer strategy framework with the thoroughness of someone who understood that their work would outlast their presence, which was its own strange kind of responsibility. He wrote transition notes that were honest about what was hard and what was subtle, and what required judgment that couldn't be fully systematized, because he'd been the beneficiary of exactly that kind of honesty once, and he knew what it was worth. He had a final call with Sandra Voss on the second to last week. She took the news of his departure with the composed professionalism of someone who had managed many transitions. And then at the end of the call, she said, "The recognition framework is going to be in our brand guidelines for a long time. I want you to know that." "I'm glad it's useful," he said. "It's more than useful," she said. "It changed how our team thinks about the customer relationship. That's the kind of thing that outlasts the engagement." He carried that home with him. He thought about it the way he thought about all the things that had accumulated in this year, not as trophies, not as reassurance against future doubt, but as evidence of something real. He had put true things into the world. Some of them had landed. Some of them had done what true things occasionally do, which is travel further than you expected. That was enough. That was more than enough. His last day at Kensington Creative was a Friday in late April. Chicago in late April was doing the thing it occasionally did, warm enough to feel like a promise. The lake visible from the right windows as something blue-gray and vast, the trees along the streets coming back into leaf with that particular urgency of things that have been waiting through a long winter and are now making up for lost time. The team did something small and real for him. Not the awkward gathering in the kitchen thing, but a lunch, just the people who had actually been in the trenches with him. Devin and Jess and Rachel and 2 others from the Meridian team. They went to the Thai place around the corner, the one he'd ordered from with Sophie on Wednesdays sometimes, and they sat around a big table and ate and talked and made the kind of jokes that are only possible between people who have been through something genuinely hard together. Devin said, halfway through lunch, "You realize you're the only person who's ever been sent on a trip by Kensington and come back a completely different version of themselves." "I wasn't a different version," Liam said. "I was the same version, just louder." "Louder is different in your case," Rachel said, without looking up from her food. "That is accurate," Jess agreed. Jess agreeing with something without qualification was a high bar, and everyone at the table recognized it. Patrick Healy stopped by briefly near the end. Not to stay, not to join the lunch, just to stop at the table on his way to somewhere else, and shake Liam's hand with the specific firmness of a man making a deliberate gesture. "The Meridian work is going to be in our portfolio for a long time," he said. "That's yours. I want you to know I know that." "It was the team's," Liam said. Patrick looked at him. "The recognition framework is yours," he said. "Take the credit. You earned it." He left. Liam looked at the space Patrick had occupied for a moment and thought about how long that acknowledgement had taken and how much it had cost Patrick to give it, and how much more it meant because of both those things. Ava came to his desk at 4:30. He was packing the last of his things, not much because he'd never been someone who accumulated a lot of desk presents, but his notebooks, his coffee mug, the small framed photo of Sophie that lived in the upper right corner of his monitor. She stood across from the desk while he packed, which was a different configuration than any they'd had before. Him doing something domestic and conclusive, her watching. "The Toronto office starts when?" she asked. 3 weeks. They want me there by the 15th of May. Have you found a place?" "Renting first. We'll figure out the rest later." She nodded. Then she reached into the folder she was carrying and placed a single piece of paper on his desk. He looked at it. It was a reference letter. His name was at the top. Her name was at the bottom. In between was a single paragraph, dense, specific, and completely lacking in the generic complimentary language that reference letters usually consisted of. It described the consumer strategy framework. It described the Milwaukee pitch and the December reconstruction and the Meridian engagement. It described, in 2 sentences that he had to read twice, what she called his structural instinct for the relationship between true language and consumer trust. He picked it up. He read it. "You don't need it for this role," she said. "The offer is confirmed, but you'll need it for what comes after, and I won't always be the person who knows the full story." She paused. "So now you have it. In writing." He held the paper. He looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. Then she put her hand out, which was both formal and real, the kind of gesture that acknowledges that something is ending and doesn't try to make it more or less than that. He shook it. "Go be useful somewhere else," she said. And then she turned and walked back to her office, and the door didn't close behind her because it never really had to. She was always already where she was going. He put the letter carefully in his bag, between his last notebook and the small frame with Sophie's photo. He picked up the coffee mug. He looked at his desk, cleared now, just the desk itself, the monitor dark, the space already impersonal in the way of places that have been emptied of their specific person. He'd come to this desk 4 years ago as a man trying to hold everything together with both hands and no safety net and no particular belief that he was doing it right. He was leaving it as something different, not finished. He was a long way from finished, and he understood that more clearly now than he ever had. But built. More built than he'd been. More himself. He said goodbye to Rachel last, because Rachel was the kind of person you said goodbye to last. Don't become one of those people who gets successful and stops being interesting, she said, still not looking up from her screen because Rachel's goodbyes were architecturally opposed to sentimentality. I'll try, he said. Try harder than that. Okay. She looked up then, just briefly. Her face did something small and real. You were always better than you thought you were, she said. I'm glad you finally found that out. He picked up his bag. Thank you for putting up with me for 3 years. 2 feet away, she said. It wasn't hard. She went back to her screen. Go. He went. The elevator. The lobby, the glass doors. The April afternoon. Actual warmth in it, the kind you could feel on your face, and the city moving around him in its ordinary ongoing way, indifferent and enormous and alive. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, not performing anything, just standing in the space of it. This city, this life, this version of himself. Then he walked to the L and went home to his daughter. Toronto in May was greener than he expected. He'd built an image of it from research and photographs and the particular way cities look when you understand them only through a screen. And the real thing was different the way real things always are. More dimensional, more specific, with a quality that photographs don't capture because it's not visual. It was the rhythm of the place, the pace of it. The way the lake, a different lake, Lake Ontario, vast and cold and present, anchored the city's geography in a way that made Chicago's relationship with Lake Michigan feel familiar even from 1,000 miles away. He found them an apartment in a neighborhood with good schools and a park nearby, and a bakery on the corner that Sophie declared acceptable after her first croissant, which she ate with the discriminating focus of a food critic and then asked for a second one, which was her highest form of approval. Sophie's new school had art. He'd made sure of that. The first weeks in Toronto were hard in the specific way that new beginnings are hard. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything required active navigation, rather than the automatic competence that comes with familiarity. He didn't know which grocery store had the brand of orange juice Sophie liked. He didn't know the fastest route to the office, or which coffee place was actually good, or where to take a sick child on a Sunday, when everything seemed closed. He had to figure all of it out from scratch, and figuring things out from scratch at 33 with a 7-year-old and a new director-level job was genuinely demanding in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. But the work was good. The work was immediately, unmistakably good. He'd spent 4 years at Kensington Creative being good at his function. He was now in a position where his function was to help other people be good at theirs. And it turned out that these were related but different skills. And he was not automatically excellent at the second one just because he was good at the first. He made mistakes. He over-explained in the first team meetings, giving context that people didn't need because he was still operating in the mode of a person who justified his presence in rooms. He under-delegated in the first month, holding on to tasks that should have been handed off because releasing control felt like losing track of quality. A woman on his team named Priya, who was 26 and smarter than she was given credit for, and who reminded him of himself in specific and uncomfortable ways, told him at the end of his first month, with the careful diplomacy of someone who had decided he was worth the risk of honesty. You brief us really well, and then you check our work in a way that makes us feel like you're expecting it to be wrong. He sat with that for a day. Then he told her she was right and asked her to tell him when she saw it happening again. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he recognized, the expression of someone who had braced for defensiveness and received honesty instead, and didn't quite know what to do with that. Okay, she said. I will. He got better. Not quickly, not without backsliding. He over-controlled in stressful weeks and had to recalibrate. He gave feedback that was occasionally more direct than the person on the receiving end was ready for, and learned to read the difference between directness that was useful and directness that was just efficient for him. He had weeks where he was good and weeks where he was the kind of leader he didn't want to be, and the weeks where he was less good were often more instructive than the better ones. He thought about Ava often in those early months, not with longing, not for Chicago or for the specific job or for any version of things going back, but with the particular quality of attention you give to someone who has shown you something about how a thing should be done. He thought about how she read people, how she made her attention feel like information rather than evaluation, how she said the true thing without apology and without decoration, and how that quality, which he'd experienced as slightly unnerving when he first encountered it, was actually one of the most respectful things one person could offer another. It said, "I think you can handle the real thing. I'm not going to manage your feelings by softening it." He tried to do that. He didn't always succeed, but he tried. Sophie settled. It took 3 months for the new school to feel like her school, and in those 3 months she had one bad week where she cried twice and said she missed Mrs. Baxter and Liam sat with her through both times and didn't try to fix it or redirect it, just let her feel what she was feeling until it passed. By September, she had 2 friends, a girl named Kala, who shared her commitment to expressive art forms, and a boy named Tomas, who had apparently distinguished himself by having the most interesting lunchbox contents of anyone in the class, which Sophie described as a significant quality in a person. Mrs. Baxter came in August, as promised. She stayed for 5 days. She walked the city with Sophie while Liam was at work and came back every evening with some piece of Toronto she'd found interesting. A market, a mural, a very good cheese shop that she approved of, a conversation she'd had with a woman on a bench who turned out to share her opinion about the correct way to fold a dish towel. She sat in his kitchen and drank tea and looked at his apartment with the assessing eye of someone who was checking that a life had been properly set up and appeared satisfied with what she found. On her last evening, she said, "You look right here." He was washing dishes. He looked over at her. "What does that mean?" "It means you look like a person who is in the right place." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said things that were true. Some people look slightly sideways in their own lives, like they're occupying a space that fits almost but not quite. You don't look like that anymore. He thought about the apartment on the north side of Chicago, the water stain shaped like Ohio, the alarm at 6:47. "I was sideways for a long time," he said. "I know." She finished her tea. "You're not anymore." He took that to bed with him that night and lay in the dark of his Toronto bedroom listening to the city outside, different sounds than Chicago, a different texture of urban noise, and thought about the distance he'd traveled. Not geographically, the other kind. He had been a man who rehearsed apologies he hadn't been asked to give, who waited for permission, who put his best thinking in the margin and called it the draft, who had spent years being genuinely good at something and genuinely convinced that the goodness wasn't enough to deserve an audience. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't the opposite of that man either. He hadn't swung into some loud, uncomplicated confidence that bore no resemblance to who he actually was. He still doubted. He still had mornings where the gap between what he was trying to do and what he was actually managing felt uncomfortably wide. He still had a voice in the back of his head that tried, at vulnerable moments, to tell him he was overextended, over his head, one exposed miscalculation away from being found out. The difference was that he didn't believe it anymore. Or rather, he heard it, and he kept going anyway, because he'd learned in a Milwaukee conference room and a December reconstruction and a Thursday afternoon in Ava Kensington's office that the voice wasn't information, it was just noise. And the way to respond to noise was to do the work. Time moved the way time does when a life is full, faster than you think it should, and richer than you realize while it's happening. The Vantage Group North American office grew, not without difficulty. There were accounts they didn't win, pitches that fell apart at the last stage. A quarter in his second year, where the numbers were bad enough that he had several conversations with the London leadership that were uncomfortable in the specific way of conversations where everyone is being professional while the stakes are genuinely high. He managed those conversations the way Ava had taught him to manage hard things, with directness, without deflection, with the data in hand and an honest account of what had happened and what he was going to do about it. They came back from the bad quarter. The team built something that was distinctly theirs, a consumer strategy practice that was known within the industry for a particular quality of voice work. The recognition framework that had started in a Milwaukee hotel room at midnight became, over years, the foundational approach of a practice that attracted clients and talent both. He hired Priya as senior strategist in his third year. He was glad every day that she'd told him what she told him in month one. He spoke at an industry conference in his fourth year. He said things he believed, without hedging them for palatability, and the room responded the way rooms respond to true things. with the particular quality of attention that is different from polite interest. Afterward, a young woman stopped him in the corridor and said she'd been struggling with a pitch for 6 months, and something he'd said about recognition versus persuasion had clarified something she'd been unable to articulate. He told her the idea had come from a conversation he'd had at midnight in Milwaukee with someone who understood his work better than he did at the time. She asked who. He said, "My former boss. She's the best reader of people I've ever met." He kept in touch with Ava the way people keep in touch when they respect each other and are both busy, occasionally, meaningfully, without the maintenance obligations of lesser connections. She sent him an email when Kensington Creative won a significant award, and he replied. He sent her the link when the Vantage consumer strategy practice was covered in an industry publication, and she replied in 3 sentences that were more generous than they needed to be and less effusive than they might have been, which was exactly right. He texted her a photo of Sophie on the day she started middle school. Not because there was a reason to, exactly, but because Ava had known Sophie's name before she'd ever met her, and that felt like the kind of thing that deserved acknowledgement. She replied, "She looks like she's already running the school." He showed Sophie the text. Sophie read it, nodded, and said, "She's right." He'd have expected nothing else. The day that stayed with him, the one that became the hinge point in his understanding of everything, happened on an ordinary Tuesday in his 5th year when a junior strategist named Marcus walked into his office. Not Marcus from Chicago. A different Marcus, 24 years old, 2 months into the job, with the particular energy of someone who was very smart and not yet sure if his smart was the useful kind. He knocked on the open door and stood in the doorway with a document in his hand, and the expression of someone who had talked themselves into and out of this visit several times on the way down the hall. "Do you have a minute?" he said. "Yeah," Liam said. "Come in." Marcus came in and sat across from him and held the document with both hands in a way that suggested it was either very important or he was using it for ballast. "I've been working on the consumer entry framework for the Alderton account," he said, "and I have an idea that it might be completely off base. It's probably off base. You've seen the brief, so you know the parameters, and I'm sure there are reasons this wouldn't work that I'm not seeing yet." "Stop," Liam said. Marcus stopped. Liam looked at him, at the document, at the expression on the face of a young man who had spent the walk down the hall pre-apologizing for an idea he hadn't yet been given the chance to share. He knew that walk. He had been that walk. "What's the idea?" he said. Marcus blinked. "I haven't finished explaining. You've been explaining why it might not work for about 45 seconds. What's the actual idea?" A pause. Then, slightly differently, less hedged, more direct. The brief positions Alderton as a premium option competing on quality, but the consumer data suggests their actual decision-making customers aren't choosing on quality perception. They're choosing on risk reduction. They're people who've made a bad purchase before, and they're not looking for the best option. They're looking for the safest option. He set the document on the desk. If we position on quality, we're speaking to a purchasing instinct that isn't driving the decision. If we position on certainty, on Alderton being the choice you won't regret, we're speaking to the actual thing. Liam looked at him. He looked at the document. He thought about a hotel conference room in Milwaukee, about the first time he'd said a true thing in a room that mattered and felt the room change because of it, about everything that had required someone else to believe in it first. "That's good," he said. Marcus looked at him with the expression of someone who has been bracing for a polite redirection and received something else. "That's a genuinely good instinct," Liam said, "and I want you to notice something." He held Marcus's gaze. "You almost didn't bring it to me. You came in pre-apologizing for it. You were making yourself small before I'd had the chance to tell you whether you should be." Marcus was quiet. "Don't do that," Liam said. "Not because it's unprofessional, not because it makes you look uncertain. Do you understand why I'm telling you not to do it?" "Because the idea is good," Marcus said cautiously. "Because you can't know if the idea is good until you give it a fair hearing. And you can't give it a fair hearing if you've already half killed it before it leaves the room." Liam leaned back in his chair. "You have good instincts. I've been watching you for 2 months, and you have good instincts. But good instincts that you apologize for before you share them don't do anyone any good, including you." Marcus looked at the desk. Something was moving across his face. Not quite emotion, more like recalibration. The specific internal shifting of a person receiving information that locates something they hadn't had language for. "Someone told me that once," Liam said. "Not those exact words, but the same idea." He picked up the document. "Let's work on the Alderton positioning. Come back at 3 with an expanded version of the certainty framing." Marcus stood. He was already different in his posture than he'd been 2 minutes ago. Something less compressed, more present. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Liam said. "Just come back at 3 with the work." Marcus left. Liam sat alone in his office. Through the window, Toronto was doing what cities do on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Moving, indifferent, ongoing. The lake was visible from his window on the right days, and this was one of them, gray and flat and enormous. He thought about a question he'd been asked years ago, in a different office in a different city. What question should you be asking? And the answer that had taken him years to locate properly. Whether this is the life I want to be living. He looked around his office, at the work on his desk, at the team visible through the glass wall. Priya on a call, a junior writer with headphones in, 2 strategists at the whiteboard working through something, at the city outside, at the life that had assembled itself out of all the things he'd been through, the grief and the fear and the years of holding everything together while doubting that he was doing it right, and the Milwaukee hotel room and the December reconstruction and the Thursday afternoon when a woman had told him everything she'd never told him and then sent him somewhere new. He thought about what Ava had said when he asked her why she'd argued for him. People who believe things are rarer than people who know things. He thought about what he'd learned that she hadn't said, that believing things wasn't enough on its own. You had to be willing to say them, in the room, out loud, to the people who needed to hear them, even when the saying was the scary part, especially then. He picked up his pen and opened his notebook to a clean page. He wrote at the top, "Don't make yourself smaller before others have had the chance to see your worth." He'd written versions of that sentence in different ways across different notebooks, in different cities. Each version was slightly more certain than the last. This one was the most certain. He looked at it and thought, that's the one. Not because it was perfect, because it was true in the way that only things you've earned through the actual living of them get to be true. Not wisdom borrowed from someone else's experience, his own. Built from the years of it, from the wrong turns and the careful self-erasure and the Milwaukee morning and the woman who believed in him before he did and the 7-year-old who had told him that brave was doing it when it was scary and who had been right and who was now in middle school in Toronto running things, according to Ava Kensington's accurate assessment. He had not become a man without doubt. He had not become a man who found everything easy or who moved through the world with the frictionless confidence that some people performed and others, fewer, actually possessed. He was still imperfect in the specific ways he'd always been imperfect, and had added some new imperfections in the years of leading a team, and would certainly add more. But he was a man who said the true thing, who showed up in the room and gave his best thinking its fair hearing, who had learned, slowly, imperfectly, at the cost of several years and many versions of himself, that the work of making yourself smaller is not humility. It's just a different kind of selfishness. It withholds the thing you have to give and calls the withholding safety. He closed the notebook. He looked at Sophie's school photo on his desk, her 7th grade photo. She was 12 now and had her mother's eyes still, always her mother's eyes, and a new quality in her expression that was harder to name, something that was still forming, some version of herself she was in the middle of becoming. He thought about the day he'd told her about Toronto. "You said brave is doing it when it's scary, so you should do it." 7 years old, holding her fork, blueberry on her chin, giving him the permission he needed to want the thing he actually wanted. His kid. He had been trying for 12 years to be enough for her. He still was. He probably always would be. But he understood now that enough was not a static thing, not a threshold you reached and then maintained. It moved. It grew with her. And the best thing he could do for her was not to be sufficient, but to be real. To be a person who was actually in his own life, actually trying, actually saying the true thing and meaning it. He thought she already knew this. He thought she'd known it longer than he had. He picked up his phone and sent her a text. Just a simple one, the kind of text that didn't require context because the context was 12 years of the same language between the same two people. How was school today? Her reply came back in 40 seconds. Fine. We had art. I made a bowl. He smiled at that. A bowl or a general shape? He typed. A pause. Then, expressive form, Dad. He laughed out loud in his empty office. He put his phone down. He picked up the document Marcus had left on his desk and started reading it, because Marcus was coming back at 3, and the work needed his full attention, which had always been, the one thing he'd never had trouble giving. Outside, the city continued. The lake held steady at the edge of everything, cold and permanent and indifferent in the way of large natural things that outlast whatever human dramas unfold on their shores. The afternoon moved toward evening. Somewhere in a middle school across the city, a girl with her mother's eyes was making something with expressive form and calling it a bowl. And one day she would tell someone that her father had taught her that Brave was doing it when it was scary, not knowing that her father had learned it from her. And in an office overlooking all of it, a man who had once sat in a hallway rehearsing apologies he hadn't been asked to give was sitting at his desk doing the work, which was exactly where he was supposed to be. That was the whole story. That was enough.